"You go fly, baby," Grandma Johnson said, pressing a wad of carefully counted bills into Jasmine's palm. "And you fly up front. Show them how it's done." Jasmine Taylor clutched the boarding pass in her hands like it was made of spun glass. Her eyes traced over the words again and again, hardly believing what she saw printed there. Taylor Jasmine, Seat 2B, First Class. The 17-year-old debate champion from Houston's East Ridge High School had never seen the words First Class printed next to her name before. For most of her life, just the idea of flying at all had seemed like a distant dream. But now, standing in the bustling Terminal C of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, that dream had transformed into something even grander. As she waited in the terminal, Jasmine pulled out her debate notes reviewing the key arguments for her topic on barriers in modern contracts. She had spent months researching how seemingly neutral agreements could create hidden obstacles for certain groups. The dense language of the airline's contract of carriage lay open beside her notes. She had highlighted several sections about involuntary seat reassignments and passenger rights. Section 21.3, she muttered to herself. Passengers with confirmed seat assignments may only be reassigned in case of operational safety or security reasons with appropriate compensation for any downgrade. She had studied these rules carefully, wanting to understand her rights for her first flying experience. Her phone buzzed with a text from her debate coach, Ms. Patterson. Remember, contracts are power relationships disguised as neutral agreements. Safe travels. The air in the terminal hummed with the familiar sounds of travel, the muffled announcements echoing from overhead speakers, the rhythmic clacking of rolling suitcases against tile floors, and the constant low murmur of 1,000 private conversations happening simultaneously. To Jasmine, it was the soundtrack of possibility. She adjusted the strap of her single carry-on bag, all she'd need for the 3-day trip, and straightened the collar of her navy blue blazer, a lucky thrift store find she'd had tailored with the money she'd saved from her first tutoring checks. The blazer was her armor, her professional skin, the thing that made her feel like she belonged in rooms where people like her weren't always welcome. Final boarding call for Flight 1108 to LaGuardia, came the announcement. Jasmine took a deep breath and headed toward Gate C-27. The past 6 months had been a blur of activity, all aimed at this moment. When her debate team at East Ridge High had qualified for the National Youth Forensics Championship in New York City, it should have been a moment of pure celebration. But reality had quickly set in. The school could only afford to send the team on a 48-hour bus journey, which would leave them exhausted before they even began competing. Jasmine couldn't let that happen. Not after she'd spent months crafting her argument on barriers in modern contracts, a topic that explored how seemingly neutral agreements could contain hidden obstacles for certain groups. Not after she'd practiced in front of her bathroom mirror until her throat was raw and her arguments flowed like water. So she had made a plan. She'd taken a job sweeping floors at Mr. Green's barbershop after school. She'd started tutoring freshmen in geometry at $15 per hour. She'd organized weekend community car washes standing in the hot Houston sun until her skin darkened 3 shades deeper. And slowly, dollar by dollar, she'd saved. But it wasn't just her effort. When word spread about what Jasmine was trying to do, her community had rallied. The regulars at the barbershop started leaving extra tips earmarked for her plane fund. Her church congregation had taken up a special collection. Her parents, already working double shifts to keep the family afloat, had somehow found extra dollars to contribute. That girl's going places, she'd overheard Mr. Green tell a customer one day. Might as well get there in style. And now, after all that work, Jasmine was about to board her very first flight. Not just any flight, but one where she'd be sitting in first class. One where she'd be treated like someone who mattered. As she approached Gate C-27, a flicker of anxiety passed through her. What if she did something wrong? What if she somehow didn't belong there despite having paid for her ticket? She'd researched what to expect in first class, but research wasn't experience. She pushed the thought aside. She had every right to be there just like anyone else with a valid ticket. She checked her watch. a hand-me-down from her older sister who'd joined the Army last year. The debate team had already flown ahead on the budget tickets the school provided. Jasmine would be meeting them in New York tonight, ready to compete tomorrow. She'd arranged everything perfectly. As she approached gate C-27, she observed the other first-class passengers waiting to board. Mostly men in expensive suits with luxury watches, a few women with designer handbags and perfect blowouts. Jasmine straightened her posture, lifting her chin slightly. She belonged here just as much as they did. She'd paid for her seat fair and square. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend, Keisha. "Girl, you really doing this? Send pics from first class." Jasmine smiled, typing back quickly. "About to board. We'll send selfie from fancy seat." Ahead of her, the gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will now begin boarding American Airlines Flight 1108 to LaGuardia. We'll start with our concierge key members and first-class passengers." Jasmine's heart leapt. That was her. She was a first-class passenger. She stepped forward, joining the short line of premium travelers. A businessman in an Italian suit gave her a curious glance but said nothing. An older woman with a tennis bracelet looked her up and down before returning attention to her phone. Jasmine ignored them both, focusing instead on the feeling of her boarding pass between her fingers, the tangible proof of what hard work and community support could achieve. The gate agent, a woman in her late 50s with stiff blonde hair and a permanently pinched expression, looked up from her computer. Her name tag read Margaret Wilson in crisp black letters. Her eyes scanned the waiting area and locked directly onto Jasmine. Behind the counter, Margaret's workstation had several personal touches. A photo of two college-aged kids smiling from a vacation somewhere sunny, a small potted succulent, and a calendar with what looked like tuition payment dates circled in red. The contrast between her personal life and her professional demeanor was striking, as if she left the warmth of those photos at home when she came to work. "You," Margaret called, beckoning with a single finger. "Young lady in the blue blazer. Come here." Jasmine's stomach tightened. Had she done something wrong? Was her carry-on too large? She approached the podium, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Yes, ma'am," she said politely. "Let me see your boarding pass," Margaret said, her voice flat and cold. "Of course." Jasmine handed it over, watching as the woman's eyes narrowed at the paper. Margaret stared at the boarding pass for an uncomfortably long time, then turned to her computer, typing rapidly. The harsh clicking of her acrylic nails against the keyboard filled the awkward silence. As she typed, her eyes darted nervously toward her supervisor across the gate area, a balding man who was dealing with another passenger. "There's a problem with this ticket," Margaret finally said, not meeting Jasmine's eyes directly. "A problem." Jasmine's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I checked in online this morning and everything was fine." "The system says this seat is inoperable," Margaret replied, her eyes flicking to the side in a way that made Jasmine instantly suspicious. "Inoperable? What does that mean?" "There's a mechanical fault with seat 2B." Margaret's tone suggested this should be obvious. Jasmine frowned. Something didn't add up. "Is there another first-class seat available I paid for first class?" Margaret's eyebrows shot up at the word paid, as if the very concept was surprising. "You paid for this?" The emphasis on "you" was subtle but unmistakable. "Yes, ma'am. I worked extra jobs for 6 months to afford it." Margaret's expression didn't soften. "The only thing I have available is a seat in the main cabin. You'll have to take that." "But that's not right," Jasmine protested, feeling heat rise to her face. "This is a confirmed first-class ticket. If the seat is truly broken, I should at least get a refund for the difference in fare." "We don't rebook for mechanical issues." Margaret snapped the lie, compounding. "You're lucky we have a seat for you at all. The flight is oversold." Just as Jasmine was about to respond, a commotion erupted behind her. A couple hurried toward the gate, both flushed and breathless as if they'd been running. "We're here. We're here," announced the woman who appeared to be in her late 40s with obvious cosmetic work and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the fluorescent airport lighting. The man with her, presumably her husband, was still on his phone, his voice loud and important as he barked something about quarterly projections. Both were dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than Jasmine's entire wardrobe. "Gregory, get off the phone," the woman scolded, then turned to Margaret with a familiar smile. "Margaret, darling, you saved us." Margaret Wilson's entire demeanor transformed. Her sour expression bloomed into a warm, saccharine smile. "Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Morrison," she practically cooed. "I was so worried you wouldn't make it. I held the seats for you just like I promised." Gregory Morrison discreetly slipped Margaret what appeared to be a folded bill along with his boarding pass. "The Dallas-Houston route is looking tight next month," he said with significance. "My secretary will call you about our seats." Margaret's expression shifted relief mixed with calculation. "I understand, Mr. Morrison. I'll make sure you're taken care of as always." The exchange was subtle but unmistakable to Jasmine. This wasn't just about today's seats. This was an ongoing arrangement. Jasmine's blood ran cold as she watched Margaret's fingers fly across the keyboard. Then, in a moment that would replay in Jasmine's mind for months to come, Margaret took Jasmine's boarding pass and deliberately tore it in half. The sound was shocking, a crisp, final RIP that seemed to echo in Jasmine's ears like a gunshot. What are you doing?" Jasmine stammered, her voice rising in disbelief. Margaret didn't even look at her. She was too busy printing 2 new boarding passes from the machine. "Here you go, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. 2B and 2C. Have a wonderful flight." "Oh, you're a lifesaver, Margaret," Mrs. Morrison gushed. "After all that awful traffic on the 635 and that unpleasantness with our original booking." "It's all taken care of," Margaret said with a conspiratorial wink. The Morrisons. Without a single glance at the girl whose ticket had just been destroyed, breezed down the jet bridge chatting about dinner reservations. Jasmine stood frozen, staring at the torn halves of her boarding pass still clutched in Margaret's hand. You gave them my seat," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You just gave away my seat that I paid for. You lied to me." "Watch your tone," Margaret said, her voice dropping back to its icy monotone. The smile she'd shown the Morrisons was completely gone. "They are priority passengers. There was a seating mix-up. There was no mix-up until you gave them my seat." Jasmine's voice rose, and several passengers in the boarding line turned to look. "You're in 34E now," Margaret said, her voice low and threatening. She printed a flimsy new boarding pass and shoved it at Jasmine. "It's that or you don't fly at all. You're causing a disturbance." "Do you want me to call security?" The threat hung in the air, thick and toxic. Jasmine, a 17-year-old black girl alone in an airport, knew exactly what calling security could mean. It could mean missing her flight. It could mean missing her competition. It could mean losing everything she had worked for. The injustice of it burned in her chest, stinging her eyes with hot tears she refused to let fall. "No," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled emotion. She snatched the new boarding pass. "But you're a thief." "Board the plane," Margaret hissed, "or you'll be spending the night in a DFW holding cell." Humiliated, shaking and utterly defeated, Jasmine Taylor scanned her fraudulent boarding pass and walked down the jet bridge, leaving her dignity at the gate. As she entered the tunnel leading to the aircraft, Jasmine's mind raced. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about being seen as less than about having something rightfully hers taken away simply because someone decided she didn't belong. It was about the casual cruelty with which Margaret had torn her ticket, not even attempting to hide what she was doing. The jet bridge seemed a mile long. With each step, the reality of what had just happened settled heavier on her shoulders. She had been robbed not in a dark alley, but under the bright fluorescent lights of an airport gate by a woman in a corporate uniform. By the time she reached the aircraft door, Jasmine had composed herself externally, though inside she was still reeling. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "First-class passengers, we invite you to board at this time." Margaret Wilson's voice echoed through gate C-27, setting off a flutter of activity among the well-dressed travelers in the premium boarding lane. Jasmine Taylor stood in the first-class line, her heartbeat quickening with each step forward. The navy blue blazer she wore, a thrift store treasure she'd had altered to fit perfectly, made her feel polished and prepared. In her hand, she clutched her boarding pass with Seat 2B, first class clearly printed on it. This moment represented more than just a flight. It was the culmination of months of extra work, community support, and personal sacrifice. Every floor she'd swept at Mr. Green's barber shop, every geometry problem she'd explained to struggling freshmen, every car she'd washed under the blazing Houston sun, all of it had led to this moment. As the line inched forward, Jasmine observed the other first-class passengers. Most were business travelers with expensive luggage and preoccupied expressions. A few glanced at her curiously. A 17-year-old black girl wasn't the typical first-class demographic. But Jasmine had anticipated this. She stood tall, her expression composed. She belonged here just as much as anyone else. When she was 3 people away from the boarding scanner, Margaret Wilson looked up from her computer terminal, her gaze landing directly on Jasmine. Something in the gate agent's expression shifted, a subtle hardening around the eyes, a tightening of her mouth. Behind the counter, Margaret's workstation had several personal touches. A photo of 2 college-aged kids smiling from a vacation somewhere sunny, a small potted succulent, and a calendar with what looked like tuition payment dates circled in red. The contrast between her personal life and her professional demeanor was striking, as if she left the warmth of those photos at home when she came to work. "You," Margaret called, pointing one manicured finger directly at Jasmine. "Young lady in the blue blazer. Come here, please." Jasmine felt eyes turning toward her as she stepped out of line. Had she done something wrong? Was there a problem with her ticket? "Yes, ma'am," she asked, approaching the counter with a politeness that had been drilled into her since childhood. Margaret Wilson, with her tight blonde perm and frost blue eyeshadow, didn't return the courtesy. "Let me see your boarding pass," she demanded, her tone clipped and cold. Jasmine handed over her boarding pass, watching carefully as Margaret scrutinized it, her French manicured nails tapping against the counter in a staccato rhythm. "Is there a problem?" Jasmine asked when the silence stretched too long. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. Her eyes narrowed at the screen. As she typed, dark circles under her eyes became more noticeable. She looked tired, stressed. She glanced nervously toward her supervisor across the gate area, a balding man who was dealing with another passenger. "What's your name again?" she asked, though the boarding pass with Jasmine's name was right in front of her. "Jasmine Taylor," she replied, a small knot of anxiety beginning to form in her stomach. Margaret continued typing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she looked up, not quite meeting Jasmine's eyes. "There's a problem with this ticket." The knot in Jasmine's stomach tightened. "What kind of problem? I checked in online this morning and everything was confirmed. The system is showing that Seat 2B is inoperable." Margaret said, her eyes shifting slightly to the left, a telltale sign of dishonesty that Jasmine had learned about in debate club. "Inoperable," Jasmine repeated, frowning. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means there's a mechanical fault with the seat. It can't be used on this flight." Margaret's tone suggested she was explaining something to a particularly slow child. Jasmine took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. That's strange because when I checked in this morning there was no mention of any problem with the seat. These things happen last minute, Margaret said dismissively. Maintenance flagged it after your check-in. Something didn't feel right, but Jasmine decided to be practical. Okay, if that seat isn't available, can I be assigned to another first-class seat? I specifically saved up to fly first class. Margaret's eyebrows shot up at this, a flash of disbelief crossing her features. You paid for a first-class ticket? The emphasis she placed on you was subtle but unmistakable. Jasmine felt her cheeks warm but kept her voice steady. Yes, I did. 6 months of extra work to afford it. Margaret's expression didn't soften. Instead, she pursed her lips and turned back to her computer. The first-class cabin is completely full. The only available seat is 34E in the main cabin. 34E? Jasmine repeated, dismayed. That's all the way in the back, isn't it? It's that or nothing, Margaret replied coldly. The flight is oversold. Jasmine knew her rights as a passenger. She'd researched them extensively before buying her ticket. If you're downgrading me from first class to economy due to a mechanical issue, I should receive a refund for the fare difference and probably compensation for the inconvenience. That's airline policy. Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. Listen, young lady, I don't have time for this. We don't rebook for mechanical issues. You're lucky we have a seat for you at all with how full this flight is. Before Jasmine could respond, a commotion erupted behind her. A couple in their late 40s burst through the terminal, moving quickly toward the gate. The woman wore a cream-colored designer outfit with gold accessories, while the man was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit with an ostentatious watch glinting on his wrist. We're here. We made it, the woman exclaimed breathlessly. The man was still on his phone, talking loudly about some business deal. I told Jenkins we'd have the numbers by end of day. Yes, the full acquisition package, hold on. He lowered the phone slightly. Elizabeth, are we boarding now? Gregory, get off the phone. The woman, Elizabeth, scolded before turning to Margaret with a familiar smile. Margaret, darling, you saved us. Jasmine watched in disbelief as Margaret Wilson's entire demeanor transformed. The stern, cold gate agent suddenly blossomed into a picture of customer service warmth. Mrs. Morrison. Mr. Morrison, Margaret said, her voice dripping with deference. I was so worried you wouldn't make it. I held the seats for you just like I promised. Gregory Morrison discreetly slipped Margaret what appeared to be a folded bill along with his boarding pass. The Dallas-Houston route is looking tight next month, he said with significance. My secretary will call you about our seats. Margaret's expression shifted relief mixed with calculation. I understand, Mr. Morrison. I'll make sure you're taken care of as always. The exchange was subtle but unmistakable to Jasmine. This wasn't just about today's seats. This was an ongoing arrangement. With growing horror, she watched as Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard. Then, without warning or explanation, Margaret took Jasmine's boarding pass and deliberately tore it in half. The sound, a sharp, definitive RIP, seemed to echo in the gate area. Several nearby passengers turned to look. What are you doing? Jasmine gasped, her voice rising in shock. Margaret ignored her, completely focused instead on printing 2 fresh boarding passes from the machine. Here you go, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. 2B and 2C. Have a wonderful flight. Oh, you're a lifesaver, Margaret Elizabeth Morrison gushed, taking the boarding passes with a perfectly manicured hand. After that awful traffic on the 6:35 and all the unpleasantness with our original booking. It's all taken care of, Margaret said with a conspiratorial wink. The Morrisons, without sparing a single glance for Jasmine, breezed down the jet bridge, still chatting animatedly. Jasmine stood frozen, staring at the torn pieces of her boarding pass now lying discarded on Margaret's counter. What had just happened felt so blatant, so shocking that for a moment she couldn't process it. She started, her voice trembling with disbelief. You just gave them my seat. You lied to me. There was never any mechanical issue, was there? Watch your tone. Margaret snapped, her friendly demeanor vanishing the instant the Morrisons were out of earshot. They are priority passengers. There was a seating duplication. There was no duplication until you created one by giving away my seat. Jasmine's voice rose, drawing more attention from nearby passengers. I paid for that seat. I worked for months to afford it. You're in 34E. Margaret said, her voice low and menacing. She printed a new boarding pass and shoved it across the counter at Jasmine. It's that, or you don't fly at all. You're causing a disturbance. Do you want me to call security? The threat hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jasmine wasn't naive. She knew exactly what could happen to a young black girl who was labeled difficult or disruptive in an airport. She could be detained, could miss her flight, could lose her chance to compete in the championship she'd worked so hard to qualify for. The injustice of it all burned in her chest like fire. Her eyes stung with tears of frustration, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Margaret the satisfaction. No, she said, finally, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Then take this boarding pass and get on the plane, Margaret said coldly, pushing the flimsy document toward her. Jasmine took the new boarding pass but couldn't resist a parting shot. What you just did was wrong. It was discriminatory and probably illegal. Board the plane, Margaret hissed, or you'll be spending the night in a DFW holding cell. A few passengers still waiting to board were openly staring now. An older gentleman frowned, looking between Jasmine and Margaret with concern. A woman in business attire had paused her phone conversation, watching the scene unfold. But no one spoke up, no one intervened. A middle-aged man in a golf shirt actually turned away, pretending he hadn't witnessed anything. His deliberate avoidance stung almost as much as Margaret's actions. With as much dignity as she could muster, Jasmine took the downgraded boarding pass and moved toward the jet bridge. As she scanned the new pass, the machine beeped in confirmation, a sound that should have been exciting but now felt like a mockery. The long walk down the jet bridge gave Jasmine time to process what had just happened. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. It was about being seen as less than, about having something rightfully hers taken away simply because she didn't fit someone's image of who belonged in first class. It was about the casual cruelty with which Margaret had torn her ticket, not even attempting to hide what she was doing. It was about the Morrisons' entitlement, their complete disregard for whose seat they might be taking. By the time she reached the aircraft door, Jasmine's initial shock had hardened into something else, a quiet, smoldering determination. This wasn't right, and she wouldn't pretend it was. Behind her, more passengers from the gate area were boarding. She overheard snippets of conversation. "Did you see what just happened to that girl?" one woman whispered to her companion. "None of our business," came the reply. Best not to get involved. But they just took her seat, right in front of everyone. Look, we've all got places to be. It's unfortunate, but what can you do? What can you do? Attitude was precisely what allowed injustices small and large to persist, Jasmine thought. People witnessed unfairness and decided it was easier to look away to pretend they hadn't seen to convince themselves it wasn't their problem. As she reached the aircraft door, a new thought crystallized in her mind. She wouldn't just accept this. She wouldn't just swallow the injustice and move on. But she needed to be strategic. Getting thrown off the flight or detained by security wouldn't help her get to her competition or reclaim her rightful seat. Her debate coach had drilled into the team that effective advocacy required evidence allies and the right forum. She already had evidence: the torn boarding pass, the email confirmation, the check-in record. Now she needed to find allies and the right forum to address the wrong that had been done to her. A flight attendant greeted her at the door. A woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Sofia Alvarez. "Welcome aboard," Sofia said warmly. Jasmine managed a tight nod, not trusting her voice. First class is to your left, main cabin to the right, Sofia added cheerfully, unaware of the cruel irony of her words. Jasmine turned right, her eyes automatically flicking left into the first-class cabin. Sure enough, there were the Morrisons settling comfortably into seats 2B and 2C, her seats. Elizabeth was already handing her designer coat to another flight attendant while Gregory stowed his briefcase in the overhead bin. For a brief moment, Jasmine considered confronting them right there, asking them if they knew they were sitting in a stolen seat, if they cared that their comfort came at the expense of her dignity. But the memory of Margaret's threat stopped her. Board the plane or spend the night in a holding cell. So she turned away and continued the long walk to the back of the aircraft, past rows and rows of increasingly cramped seats all the way to row 34. The last row before the lavatories. Even before she reached it, she could smell the bathroom disinfectant. As she moved through the plane, Jasmine noticed how the passengers became increasingly diverse the further back she went. The first-class cabin was predominantly white and male. The first few rows of the main cabin had more diversity, but still skewed heavily white and professional. By the time she reached the back section, the demographic had shifted noticeably. This wasn't a coincidence, she realized. The stratification of the plane reflected broader patterns in society. Who had access to premium spaces, who was assumed to belong in them, who was protected when they tried to claim their rightful place. It was the perfect real-world illustration for her debate topic on hidden barriers in contracts. When she arrived at row 34, she found a Hispanic girl about her age already seated in the aisle seat 34F. She wore headphones and was scrolling through her phone. At the window sat an elderly man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses reading a paperback novel. "Excuse me," Jasmine said, her voice still tight with emotion. "I think I'm in the middle." The girl looked up, pulled one earbud out, and immediately smiled. "Oh, sure, no problem." She stood to let Jasmine in, revealing a colorful Debate Life t-shirt underneath her open jacket. "I'm Alexandra Garcia, but everyone calls me Alex." "Jasmine Taylor," she replied, automatically squeezing past to take the cramped middle seat. Alex settled back into her seat but kept her attention on Jasmine. "Hey, are you okay? You seem really upset." Jasmine had been planning to put in her earbuds and try to forget the whole humiliating experience, but something in Alex's genuinely concerned expression made her pause. "Not really," she admitted. "I had a first-class ticket that I saved up for months to buy, and the gate agent just gave it away to someone else. She literally tore my boarding pass in half right in front of me." Alex's eyes widened in shock. "Are you serious? They can't do that." "Well, they just did," Jasmine said bitterly. "And when I objected, she threatened to call security on me." "That's completely messed up," Alex said, her expression shifting from shock to indignation. "Did you get her name?" "You should report her," her name badge said. "Margaret Wilson," Jasmine replied. "But who would I even report her to? It's her word against mine, and we know who people tend to believe in those situations." The elderly gentleman at the window seat who had been pretending not to listen now cleared his throat. "Excuse me, young ladies. I couldn't help overhearing. What that gate agent did sounds like a clear breach of contract. You purchased a specific service, first-class transportation, and they failed to deliver it without proper cause or compensation." Jasmine turned to him, surprised. "That's exactly what I was thinking. I know the airline's contract of carriage pretty well. I actually read it before buying my ticket." "Smart girl," the man said approvingly. "Name's Arthur Williams, by the way. Retired now, but I spent 40 years as an accountant. I know a thing or two about contracts." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Williams," Jasmine said. "I'm Jasmine Taylor, and this is Alexandra Garcia. Just call me Arthur, please." He smiled kindly. "And for what it's worth, I think you have a legitimate grievance. You should document everything while it's fresh in your mind." Alex nodded enthusiastically. "That's what my mom always says. She's a public defender, and she's always telling me that documentation is the most powerful weapon against injustice." Jasmine pulled out her phone. I have screenshots of my original check-in with seat 2B assigned, and I still have the email confirmation for my first-class purchase. Good, Arthur said. And you should write down exactly what happened at the gate while it's fresh in your memory. Times, names, what was said. Details matter. As Jasmine started making notes, Alex leaned over, curious. So why were you flying first class anyway? Special occasion. I'm on my way to the National Youth Forensics Championship in New York. Jasmine explained. I'm representing my high school in policy debate. The school could only afford to send us by bus, a 48-hour ride, but I wanted to arrive rested and ready to compete, so I worked extra jobs for months to afford this ticket. Alex's face lit up. No way I'm going to the same competition Westlake Academy, Dallas. I'm in Lincoln Douglas debate. East Ridge High, Houston? Jasmine replied momentarily, forgetting her anger. What's your topic? Ethical limits of technological surveillance, Alex said. Yours? Barriers in modern contracts, Jasmine said with a bitter laugh. Ironic, right? I just got a real-world case study. That's actually perfect, Alex said thoughtfully. You should definitely incorporate this experience into your arguments. The airplane's engines grew louder as the boarding process continued. Jasmine watched as more passengers filed past, many glancing enviously at the first-class cabin as they made their way to the main cabin. I just can't believe they would do that so blatantly, Jasmine said, the hurt and anger resurging. She didn't even try to hide it. She tore my boarding pass right in front of me and gave my seat to those people, the Morrisons, who clearly knew what was happening. They called her by name, said she saved them. Arthur frowned. Sounds like a prearranged deal, perhaps even a bribe. Definitely, Alex agreed. My mom sees this kind of thing all the time in her work. People with money or connections thinking the rules don't apply to them. Jasmine looked down at the cramped space, her knees practically touching the seat in front of her. In first class, she would have had room to work on her debate notes during the flight. She'd been looking forward to that, to feeling valued, respected, treated with dignity. Instead, here she was wedged between two strangers in the very last row right next to the bathrooms, all because Margaret Wilson had decided she didn't belong in first class. It's not fair, she said quietly, more to herself than to her seatmates. No, it's not. Alex agreed firmly. And you shouldn't have to just accept it. There has to be something we can do. Just then, a chime sounded, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Michael Ramirez speaking. Welcome aboard American Airlines Flight 1108 to LaGuardia. We're just about finished with the boarding process, and we'll be pushing back from the gate shortly. Our flight time today will be approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. We're expecting a smooth ride, but we'll keep the seatbelt sign on until we've reached our cruising altitude. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure. Jasmine fastened her seatbelt, trying to focus on the positive. At least she was on the plane. At least she would make it to the competition. At least she had found some sympathetic ears in Alex and Arthur. But as she glanced toward the front of the plane, just barely able to make out the back of Elizabeth Morrison's expensively highlighted hair in seat 2B, her seat, the injustice of it all settled in her chest like a stone. The jet bridge felt a mile long. Jasmine's sneakers barely made a sound against the industrial carpet as she walked toward the aircraft, her carry-on bag suddenly feeling 10 pounds heavier on her shoulder. The humiliation at the gate had left her feeling hollow, a sharp contrast to the excitement she'd felt just minutes earlier. This isn't right, she whispered to herself, repeating it like a mantra. This isn't right. She had been robbed not in a dark alley with a weapon, but in broad daylight by a woman in a corporate uniform. The memory of Margaret Wilson's cold eyes as she tore the boarding pass in half replayed in Jasmine's mind. The sound of that tear might as well have been a slap across her face. When Jasmine finally reached the aircraft door, she paused, taking a deep breath to compose herself. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. she wouldn't show them they had broken her spirit. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, a woman with warm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name tag read, Sofia Alvarez. Unlike Margaret, Sofia's smile seemed genuine. "Welcome aboard," Sofia greeted her. Jasmine managed a tight nod, not trusting her voice. "First class is to your left main cabin to the right," Sofia added cheerfully, unaware of the painful irony of her words. Jasmine turned right, her eyes automatically drawn to the left into the first-class cabin. There they were, the Morrisons, settling into seats 2B and 2C. Her seats. Elizabeth Morrison was already handing her designer coat to another flight attendant, complaining about the temperature. Gregory Morrison was arranging his laptop on the wide tray table that would have been Jasmine's. The sight sent a fresh wave of anger through her. For a moment, she considered marching over there, confronting them, asking if they knew they were sitting in stolen seats. But the memory of Margaret's threat held her back. "Board the plane, or you'll be spending the night in a DFW holding cell." So instead, Jasmine turned away and began the long walk to the back of the plane. With each step past the spacious first-class seats, each glimpse of the amenities she'd saved so long for the injustice burned deeper. As Jasmine made her way down the aisle toward the back of the plane, not all eyes were sympathetic. A businessman in 12C glanced up from his laptop with annoyance. "Another delay because someone can't find their seat," he muttered to his seatmate. "Just sit where they tell you and file a complaint later. Some of us have connections to make." A few rows ahead, a woman in a tennis visor shook her head. "I don't know why people make such a fuss. It's just a seat." These comments stung Jasmine almost as much as Margaret's dismissal. The casual acceptance of injustice was perhaps more disheartening than the injustice itself. She couldn't help noticing how the passengers became increasingly diverse the further back she went. The first-class cabin was predominantly white and male. The first few rows of the main cabin had more diversity, but still skewed heavily white and professional. By the time she reached the back section, the demographic had shifted noticeably. This wasn't a coincidence, she realized. The stratification of the plane reflected broader patterns in society. Who had access to premium spaces, who was assumed to belong in them, who was protected when they tried to claim their rightful place. It was the perfect real-world illustration for her debate topic on hidden barriers in contracts. She reached row 34 near the very back of the aircraft, right by the lavatories. Middle seat, the worst possible option, of course. An elderly gentleman was already seated by the window, and a teenage Hispanic girl about Jasmine's age sat in the aisle seat, headphones on, scrolling through her phone. Jasmine cleared her throat. "Excuse me. I think I'm in the middle." The girl looked up, pulled out one earbud, and smiled. "Oh, sure, no problem." She stood to let Jasmine in. As Jasmine settled into the cramped middle seat, the girl held out her hand. "I'm Alexandra Garcia, but everyone calls me Alex." "Jasmine Taylor," she replied, taking the offered hand automatically. "You okay?" Alex asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "You look upset." Jasmine opened her mouth to say she was fine, the default response, but something in Alex's genuine expression made her hesitate. "Not really," she admitted. "I had a first-class ticket that I saved up for months to buy, and the gate agent just gave it to someone else. Tore my boarding pass in half right in front of me." Alex's eyes widened. "Are you serious? Can they even do that?" "Apparently they can," Jasmine said bitterly. "And when I objected, she threatened to call security." The elderly man by the window, who had been pretending not to listen, made a disapproving noise. "That's not right," he said, shaking his head. "Not right at all." "It's more than not right. It's illegal," Alex said, her voice rising with indignation. "It's breach of contract. They sold you a specific seat, and they can't just take it away unless they compensate you." Jasmine looked at Alex with newfound interest. "Are you pre-law or something?" Alex grinned. "Debate team. State champions last year. I'm heading to the National Forensics Championship in New York. No way, Jasmine said momentarily, forgetting her anger. I'm going to the same competition. I'm representing East Ridge High from Houston. Westlake Academy, Dallas. Alex said, holding up her hand for a high five, which Jasmine returned. What's your event policy debate? My topic is on barriers in modern contracts. Jasmine said, the irony not lost on her. I guess I just got a real-world example. That's some coincidence, Alex said. Then her expression turned serious. But for real, what that gate agent did was wrong. You should report her. To who? She's the one with the power. She even threatened to have me arrested if I didn't comply. Jasmine's voice caught slightly on the last word. You know, Alex said thoughtfully, my mom always says that the best weapon against injustice is documentation. Do you have your original receipt? The confirmation email with your seat assignment? Jasmine nodded. I have everything. I even took a screenshot of my check-in this morning showing seat 2B. Good, Alex said firmly. That's evidence, and I'll be your witness. I saw how upset you were when you boarded. The elderly gentleman spoke up again. I may be old, but my memory is sharp as a tack. I'd be happy to verify your account as well, young lady. What happened to you isn't right. For the first time since the confrontation at the gate, Jasmine felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't completely powerless after all. When she reached row 34, Jasmine didn't just feel defeated. She began mentally cataloging everything that had happened, framing it as she would a debate argument. Claim. The gate agent violated a binding contract. Evidence confirmed seat assignment payment receipt. Lack of operational reason. Warrant contracts must be honored regardless of who holds them. Impact beyond personal inconvenience, a pattern that affects specific groups. She realized this wasn't just about comfort, it was about dignity and equal protection under the law. She took out her phone and began documenting the incident in detail, creating a record that could serve as evidence later. Just then, a chime sounded, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Michael Ramirez speaking. We're just waiting for the final passengers to board, and then we'll be on our way to New York LaGuardia. Our flight time today will be about 3 hours and 20 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. Jasmine closed her eyes, trying to center herself. What would her debate coach, Ms. Patterson, advise in this situation? Probably to gather facts, build a case, and present it calmly and rationally to someone with authority. But who had authority over a gate agent? And would anyone believe a 17-year-old black girl over a middle-aged white airline employee? As if reading her thoughts, Alex leaned over. Don't give up, she whispered. This isn't over. Jasmine nodded, but she wasn't convinced. In her experience, justice wasn't always available to people like her. Sometimes you just had to swallow the bitter pill and move on. The memory of her grandmother's words suddenly surfaced in her mind. You go fly, baby, and you fly up front. Show them how it's done. What would Grandma Johnson say if she could see Jasmine now, relegated to the back of the plane despite having paid for a premium seat? The thought made her throat tighten with emotion. Grandma Johnson had lived through the civil rights era. She'd told Jasmine stories of segregated buses, of having to give up seats to white passengers, of being told to move to the back. Was this so different? A young black girl being removed from a premium seat she'd paid for being sent to the back of the plane while her spot was given to wealthy white passengers? No, Jasmine thought. It wasn't the same as what her grandmother had experienced. The world had changed in many ways, but the echoes were undeniable. Different methods, similar results. As if reading her thoughts, Arthur leaned over. You know, he said quietly, what happened to you has a long, ugly history in this country. People being told they don't belong in certain spaces, being removed for the comfort of others deemed more worthy. It wasn't right then, and it's not right now. Jasmine nodded, swallowing hard. I keep thinking about what my grandmother would say. She always taught me to stand up for myself, but also to pick my battles wisely. And which kind of battle do you think this is? Arthur asked gently. Before Jasmine could answer, the overhead speakers chimed and the captain's voice filled the cabin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Michael Ramirez speaking. We're just wrapping up our pre-flight checks and should be pushing back from the gate shortly. Our flight time to LaGuardia today will be approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. The weather in New York is clear, and we're expecting a smooth ride. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure. Sofia Alvarez moved efficiently through the aisle, checking that seatbelts were fastened and overhead bins were secure. When she reached row 34, she paused, noticing Jasmine's distressed expression. Everything all right back here? She asked. Alex spoke up before Jasmine could answer. Actually, no. Jasmine here had a first-class ticket that she paid for, but the gate agent took it away and gave her seat to someone else. Tore her boarding pass in half right in front of her. Sofia's expression shifted from polite concern to genuine surprise. Is that true? She asked Jasmine. Jasmine nodded, reaching for her phone. I have the proof right here. My original confirmation, my check-in with seat 2B assigned. I worked extra jobs for months to afford that ticket. Sofia glanced up the aisle, then leaned in closer. That doesn't sound right at all. Was it Margaret at the gate? Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. Yes, Margaret Wilson. You know her. A shadow crossed Sofia's face. Let's just say this isn't the first time I've heard complaints about her decisions. Let me finish securing the cabin for takeoff, and then I'll see what I can find out. Okay. Thank you, Jasmine said, feeling a small flicker of hope. As Sofia moved on, Alex turned to Jasmine with an encouraging smile. See, I told you this wasn't right. Even the flight attendant knows something's off. The aircraft began to push back from the gate, the gentle backward motion punctuated by a series of mechanical sounds from below. As they taxied toward the runway, Jasmine found herself torn between her natural inclination to avoid conflict and her growing conviction that she needed to fight this injustice. On one hand, she was on the plane. She would make it to New York for her competition. Maybe she should just let it go, focus on what mattered most, performing well in the championship she'd worked so hard to qualify for. On the other hand, letting it go felt like accepting that what had happened was somehow okay. It wasn't okay. It was theft, discrimination, a blatant abuse of power. If she said nothing, did nothing, was she enabling Margaret Wilson to do the same thing to someone else in the future? For a moment, Jasmine almost convinced herself to let it go. She could report it later, file a complaint after she arrived in New York. But something inside her rebelled against that compromise. She thought of all the times people had been told to wait for justice, to accept small indignities for the sake of convenience, to prioritize the comfort of those with power over the rights of those without. No, she decided. She wouldn't just accept this, but she needed to be strategic. The plane accelerated down the runway, pressing Jasmine back into her seat as they lifted into the air. The ground fell away beneath them, the sprawling expanse of Dallas-Fort Worth receding into a patchwork of buildings and roads. Jasmine closed her eyes, trying to center herself. What would her debate coach, Ms. Patterson, advise in this situation? Probably to gather facts, build a case, and present it calmly and rationally to someone with authority. But who had authority over a gate agent? And would anyone believe a 17-year-old black girl over a middle-aged white airline employee? As the plane climbed higher, the seatbelt sign still illuminated, Jasmine made a decision. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, then began typing a detailed account of everything that had happened from her arrival at the gate to her current situation. She included Margaret's exact words, the Morrisons' behavior, the time, the flight number, every detail she could remember. Next, she pulled up her email, finding her original ticket confirmation and the check-in receipt showing her assigned seat 2B. She took screenshots of both. Then she took a picture of her torn, invalidated boarding pass for seat 2B, followed by the replacement pass for seat 34E. Smart Alex commented, watching her document everything. Evidence is power. The seatbelt sign dinged off as they reached cruising altitude. Flight attendants began to prepare for beverage service. Up in first class, Jasmine knew they would be offering hot towels and taking drink orders. Back here, it would be a rushed cart service with limited options. Sofia Alvarez made her way down the aisle with the beverage cart stopping at each row. When she reached row 34, she had a quick whispered conversation with her colleague, then stayed behind as the other flight attendant continued with the cart. "Okay," Sofia said quietly, leaning down to speak to Jasmine. "I checked the manifest. You're right. You were originally assigned to 2B, and there's no record of any mechanical issue with that seat. Your reservation was changed manually by gate staff just before boarding." "That's unusual." "It wasn't changed," Jasmine said firmly. "It was taken away. Margaret Wilson gave my seat to those people up front, the Morrisons. They knew her by name, said she saved them." Sofia's expression grew troubled. "That's a serious allegation. Have you ever heard of Thomas Reynolds?" Jasmine shook her head. "He's in seat 1A today." Sofia continued, her voice still low. "He's an airline compliance auditor. His job is literally to monitor customer service standards and adherence to company policies. If anyone on this plane has the authority to address this situation, it's him." Jasmine felt a sudden surge of hope. "Do you think he would listen to me?" "I think he would be very interested in what happened to you," Sofia replied carefully. "I can't make any promises, but I could mention your situation to him if you'd like." Jasmine hesitated only briefly. "Yes, please. Thank you." As Sofia moved away, Arthur leaned over. "Good for you standing up for yourself. Too many people just accept injustice because fighting it seems too difficult. My grandma always says that dignity isn't something others can take from you, only something you can surrender," Jasmine said, thinking of the proud, strong woman who had raised her mother in rural Louisiana during the height of Jim Crow. "I guess I'm not ready to surrender mine." From first class, a burst of laughter carried through the cabin. Elizabeth Morrison's voice loud and entitled. Jasmine felt a renewed surge of anger. Those people hadn't just stolen a seat. They had stolen an experience that she had worked for months to earn. "You know," Alex said thoughtfully, "my debate coach always says that the most powerful arguments aren't just about logic, they're about human impact. If you do report this, don't just talk about the contract violation. Talk about what this meant to you personally. How hard you worked for that ticket, what it represented." Jasmine nodded. "It wasn't just a seat. It was 6 months of extra work. It was my community pooling their resources to help me. It was my chance to arrive at the biggest competition of my life, feeling valued and rested, not exhausted from a 2-day bus ride." "Exactly," Alex said. "That's the story that needs to be told." A movement at the front of the cabin caught Jasmine's attention. Sofia was leaning down, speaking quietly to a man in seat 1A, presumably Thomas Reynolds, the auditor she had mentioned. The man's head turned slightly, looking back toward Jasmine's row. "I think Sofia is talking to him now," Jasmine whispered to Alex. "Good," Alex replied. "Someone needs to know what happened." As the beverage service continued, Jasmine tried to distract herself by reviewing her debate notes. Her topic, barriers in modern contracts, suddenly felt less academic and more personal than ever before. She had just experienced firsthand how contracts could be selectively enforced, how the fine print could be manipulated to benefit some at the expense of others. A few minutes later, Sofia returned to their row, this time without the beverage cart. "Mr. Reynolds would like to speak with you," she said to Jasmine. "Would you be comfortable coming up to first class for a few minutes?" Jasmine felt a mixture of nervousness and vindication. "Yes, of course. I'll come too," Alex said immediately. "As a witness." Sofia hesitated. I'm not sure if I was there when Jasmine boarded, Alex insisted. I saw how upset she was. I can confirm her story. Me too, Arthur chimed in. I may be old, but my memory and my sense of justice work just fine. Sofia seemed to make a quick mental calculation. All right. After I serve the rest of the cabin, I'll come back and escort you up front. Mr. Reynolds suggested waiting until after the meal service when things are calmer. As Sofia moved on, Jasmine turned to Alex and Arthur. Thank you both. You don't even know me, but you're willing to stand up for me. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, Arthur quoted with a gentle smile. Dr. King knew what he was talking about. For the first time since the confrontation at the gate, Jasmine felt a sense of control returning. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, justice was still possible. In seat 3A, just behind Thomas Reynolds, sat a woman who had witnessed the entire interaction between Jasmine and Sofia Alvarez. She appeared to be in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant knot and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of a lifetime of professional achievement, and her watchful eyes missed nothing. Judge Eleanor Grayson had spent 38 years on the federal bench before retiring 2 years ago. She had presided over everything from landmark civil rights cases to complex corporate litigation, and her reputation for fairness and razor-sharp legal analysis had earned her both respect and fear in courtrooms across the country. When she had boarded the flight and seen the distress on the young black girl's face as she was directed to the back of the plane, something had triggered her judicial radar. 3 decades of reading witness testimonies had given Eleanor an uncanny ability to recognize genuine emotional distress, and that girl had been exhibiting it in spades. The tight set of her jaw, the deliberate control of her breathing, the way she had pointedly avoided looking at the first-class cabin as she passed. So Eleanor had observed. She had watched as Sofia spoke with the girl in the back. She had noticed the airline compliance auditor in 1A being drawn into whatever situation was unfolding. And now, as Sofia prepared to escort the girl forward, Eleanor reached for her iPad, opened her notes app, and prepared to document whatever was about to happen. If there was one thing Eleanor Grayson despised, it was injustice hiding behind procedure. And her instincts told her that was exactly what she was about to witness. I want to record what happens, she typed into her notes. If this is what I suspect, there may be a need for an independent record. Meanwhile, in seat 1A, Thomas Reynolds reviewed the flight manifest on his laptop one more time. The data was clear. Jasmine Taylor had been assigned seat 2B during online check-in. Then, 17 minutes before departure, a gate override code had been entered, reassigning her to 34E. The override was executed using Margaret Wilson's employee credentials, but there was no maintenance record, no seat malfunction report, nothing that would justify the involuntary downgrade of a confirmed passenger. Yet Thomas remained cautious. As an airline compliance auditor with 15 years of experience, he had seen his share of irregularities. But he'd also encountered passengers who exaggerated or misrepresented situations to their advantage. The fact that the displaced passenger was a young black woman while the beneficiaries were an older white couple certainly raised red flags about potential discrimination, but he needed more than demographic patterns to take action. When Sofia Alvarez first approached Thomas Reynolds about Jasmine's situation, his response was measured but cautious. These situations are rarely as clear-cut as passengers believe, he said quietly. What proof does she have that this wasn't a legitimate operational decision? Sofia hesitated. She has screenshots of her check-in with seat 2B assigned just this morning. That's not unusual in case of last-minute equipment changes. Thomas replied, his expression professional but skeptical. And the gate agent's explanation? She claimed a mechanical issue with the seat, Sofia said. But I checked with maintenance control. There's no record of any issue with 2B on this aircraft. Thomas's eyes narrowed. That's more concerning. And you said the passengers now in those seats knew the gate agent by name. They greeted her like an old friend, Sofia confirmed. Called her Margaret, said she saved them. Thomas closed his laptop. I should speak with this young woman, but understand if this is just a case of a passenger unhappy about not getting an upgrade, there will be consequences for wasting my time. Sofia nodded. I understand, sir, but I don't think that's what's happening here. Thomas decided to review the data once more before meeting with the passenger. The record showed Jasmine Taylor had purchased her first-class ticket 3 months ago, not a last-minute upgrade or standby promotion. She had checked in online at 8:17 a.m., well ahead of the flight. The seat reassignment occurred at 1:38 p.m., just as boarding was beginning with an override code that was meant for genuine mechanical issues. The picture that emerged from the data supported the young woman's account. Thomas found himself increasingly troubled by what appeared to be a clear violation of company policy and possibly federal transportation regulations regarding equitable treatment of passengers. Meanwhile, elsewhere on the plane, more potential allies were emerging. In row 15, passenger Ben Foster had been observing the situation with growing interest. As a professional videographer specializing in documentary work, he had an instinct for compelling human stories, and the young woman being escorted to first class had triggered that instinct. He had overheard fragments of conversation from nearby passengers about a girl whose first-class seat had been given away, and he had seen the flight attendant Sofia speaking with her in the back row. Now, watching her speak with officials at the front, he discreetly positioned his phone to capture what was happening. Not to intrude on privacy, but because something told him this might be an important moment that deserved to be documented. Justice often required visibility. Sofia finally returned to row 34 to escort Jasmine, Alex, and Arthur to the front of the plane. As they made their way forward, Jasmine felt the eyes of other passengers on her. Some looked curious, others sympathetic, a few visibly annoyed at what they perceived as an unnecessary disruption. "Why can't people just accept their seats and move on?" muttered a businessman in row 22 as they passed. "Some of us are trying to work here, maybe because some of us expect to get what we paid for." Alex shot back, her voice low but firm. When they reached the front of the cabin, Sofia introduced them to Thomas Reynolds. He was a middle-aged black man with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His eyes were sharp and assessing as he gestured for Jasmine to take the seat beside him. "Ms. Taylor," he began formally. "Sofia has informed me that you believe you were improperly downgraded from first class to economy. I'd like to hear your account of what happened." Jasmine took a deep breath, conscious of the Morrisons just a few rows away, pretending not to listen, but clearly attentive to the conversation. She presented her case as she would in a debate competition, clear, factual, chronological, with supporting evidence at each step. She explained how she had saved for months to afford the first-class ticket, how she had checked in that morning with her seat confirmed, and how Margaret Wilson had claimed a mechanical issue with seat 2B before giving it to the Morrisons. She described the torn boarding pass, the threat of security involvement, and showed Thomas the digital evidence she had preserved. Thomas listened intently, his expression neutral but his eyes increasingly troubled. When Jasmine finished, he turned to Alex and Arthur. "You were witnesses to some of this." "I saw her when she first boarded," Alex confirmed. "She was clearly upset and told me right away what had happened at the gate. It wasn't like she made up the story later, and I observed the torn boarding pass she was holding when she reached our row," Arthur added. "The young lady's account is consistent with the physical evidence I witnessed." Judge Eleanor Grayson watched this unfolding from her seat. Her interest piqued further. The presence of supportive witnesses and the young woman's organized presentation suggested this wasn't a simple misunderstanding or entitlement issue. When she finally approached Thomas and Jasmine, she was careful to maintain judicial neutrality. "Mr. Reynolds," she said formally. "I'm Eleanor Grayson, retired federal judge. Before I offer any observations, I want to be clear that I haven't heard the airline's full position, and I recognize there may be operational factors I'm unaware of. Thomas nodded respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. She turned to Jasmine. Young lady, I've overheard portions of your account. If you're comfortable, I'd like to ask a few clarifying questions to better understand the situation. What followed wasn't just support, but a careful examination with Judge Grayson asking pointed questions about the sequence of events. What exactly Margaret had said about the mechanical issue, and whether Jasmine had received any documentation about the seat change. Her approach was balanced but thorough, the habits of a lifetime on the bench evident in how she gathered facts before forming conclusions. Did you at any point receive written notification of the downgrade, Judge Grayson asked? No, Your Honor, Jasmine replied. Just the new boarding pass for seat 34E. And was there any offer of compensation for the difference in fare? No. When I asked about a refund, Margaret said they don't rebook for mechanicals, and that I was lucky to have a seat at all. Eleanor Grayson's expression remained neutral, but her pen moved rapidly across her iPad. She had heard enough to form an initial assessment, but true to her judicial training, she wanted to hear all sides before reaching a conclusion. Thomas turned to his computer again, pulling up additional records. According to our booking system, your first-class ticket was purchased 3 months ago, not a last-minute upgrade. Is that correct? Yes, Jasmine confirmed. I started saving in December, bought the ticket in February for today's May flight. Thomas nodded, making notes. And you completed online check-in at 8:17 a.m. today, at which time seat 2B was confirmed to you. That's right. I have the screenshot. Thomas's fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up more data. At 1:38 p.m., approximately 20 minutes before boarding, your seat assignment was changed using an override code reserved for mechanical issues. However, there is no corresponding maintenance report for seat 2B, which is required procedure for any seat designated as inoperable. He looked up at Jasmine, his professional demeanor softening slightly. Ms. Taylor, based on the evidence you've provided and our system records, I believe you were indeed improperly downgraded without cause or compensation. This represents a serious breach of our contract of carriage and company policy. The validation from an official source sent a wave of relief through Jasmine. She wasn't crazy. She hadn't misunderstood. An injustice had been done to her, and someone in authority was acknowledging it. What happens now? She asked. Before Thomas could answer, a new voice joined the conversation. Elizabeth Morrison, who had been listening from her seat just a few rows away. Her voice was tense with defensive irritation. Excuse me, but if there's some issue with these seats, perhaps you should speak with us directly, rather than having this conversation in the middle of the cabin. Thomas turned to her with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. Mrs. Morrison, we will indeed need to speak with you shortly. The issue involves the circumstances under which you and your husband were assigned seats 2B and 2C, which were previously confirmed to another passenger. Gregory Morrison looked up from his laptop, his expression hardening. We have confirmed boarding passes for these seats. Whatever administrative error occurred is the airline's problem, not ours. That's partially correct, Thomas acknowledged. The airline does bear responsibility for the actions of its employees. However, if there was any irregular arrangement regarding your seating assignment, that would be a matter we'd need to address. Elizabeth's face flushed. What exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything, ma'am. I'm investigating a reported breach of our contract of carriage. Part of that investigation involves understanding how you came to occupy seats that were previously assigned to another passenger. As this conversation unfolded, other passengers had begun to take notice. The tension in first class was palpable. Several people had discreetly taken out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. In row 5, Lisa Chen, a social media manager for a major corporation, was already composing a tweet about what she was witnessing. Watching in real time as a black teen who was kicked out of her rightful first-class seat confronts the system with remarkable poise. Flying while black. Justice in the air. Back near Jasmine and Thomas Reynolds, Sofia Alvarez had been joined by the lead flight attendant, James Wilson, no relation to Margaret. James had been briefed on the situation and looked genuinely troubled. "Ms. Taylor," he said, approaching her on behalf of the airline, "I want to apologize for what you've experienced today. This is not how we train our staff to handle any situation, and it's certainly not reflective of our values as a company." "Thank you," Jasmine replied, appreciating the acknowledgement but still feeling the sting of the injustice. "The question now," James continued, "is how we make this right." Before Jasmine could respond, a commotion erupted from seats 2B and 2C. Gregory Morrison's voice had risen to an unpleasant volume. "This is harassment," he shouted. "I want your employee number. I want your supervisor's name. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Thomas Reynolds remained unruffled. "I'm fully aware of who I'm dealing with, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether you are." Elizabeth Morrison grabbed her husband's arm. "Gregory, stop making a scene. We'll just file a complaint later." But Gregory was too far gone, his face purple with rage. "No, Elizabeth. I won't be disrespected like this." "We paid good money for these seats. Did you?" Thomas asked pointedly. "Or did you pay Margaret Wilson to give you seats that belonged to someone else?" A hush fell over the first-class cabin. The accusation hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Several passengers looked toward Jasmine, putting together the pieces of what had happened. In the main cabin, word had begun to spread as well. Alex had texted friends in other rows explaining the situation. Ben Foster, the videographer, had captured enough footage to tell a compelling story. Social media was already buzzing with early reports from passengers who had witnessed parts of the unfolding drama. Back in row 34, an empty middle seat remained, Jasmine's assigned spot. The adjacent passengers had been following updates through Alex's friends and were discussing the situation in hushed, indignant tones. "They just took her seat. Because she's black," one passenger whispered. "And she's just a kid, too. Saved up for months." I heard another replied. "That's messed up." She paid for that seat fair and square. The collective mood on the plane was shifting. What had begun as one girl's individual complaint was transforming into something larger, a matter of principle, of fairness, of right versus wrong. Up in first class, Captain Michael Ramirez had emerged from the cockpit, alerted by James that there was a situation requiring his attention. As the commanding officer of the aircraft, he had ultimate authority over what happened on his plane. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, approaching the group, "I understand we have an issue with improper passenger displacement." Thomas quickly briefed the captain on what had transpired, showing him the documentation on his laptop and the torn boarding pass that Jasmine had preserved. Captain Ramirez, a 25-year veteran with a reputation for fairness and professionalism, turned to Jasmine with a respectful nod. "Ms. Taylor, I apologize for what you've experienced today. This is not how our airline conducts business, and it's certainly not how I run my aircraft." He then turned to face the Morrisons, his expression stern but controlled. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, based on the evidence presented, it appears that you are currently occupying seats that were improperly reassigned. I'm going to have to ask you to relocate to alternative seating." Gregory Morrison exploded. "This is outrageous. We're not moving anywhere. We paid for these seats." "Actually," Thomas interjected calmly, "the evidence suggests otherwise. And as the compliance auditor on this flight, I have to advise you that refusing the captain's instructions could result in more serious consequences." Elizabeth tugged at her husband's sleeve. "Gregory, please. This is embarrassing." But Gregory was beyond reason. "You can't make us move. This is reverse discrimination. You're only doing this because she's black." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several passengers gasped. Someone muttered, "Did he really just say that?" Jasmine stood perfectly still, her expression composed despite the painful impact of his words. This was exactly the kind of moment her debate coach had prepared her for, when emotions ran high but clarity was crucial. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, "this isn't about discrimination in any direction. This is about a contract. I purchased a service that was taken from me without cause or compensation. The fact that you believe your entitlement to my seat is more valid than my actual purchase of it is the real issue here." A murmur of approval rippled through the watching passengers. Eleanor Grayson nodded approvingly, impressed by Jasmine's composure and clarity under pressure. Captain Ramirez regarded Jasmine with newfound respect, then turned back to the Morrisons. "Mr. Morrison, Ms. Taylor is correct. This is a contractual matter, and as captain, I have the authority to enforce proper seating assignments on my aircraft. You have two options: move to the seats we assign you, or be removed from this flight at our next possible landing point for interfering with crew instructions." The ultimatum silenced Gregory Morrison momentarily. He looked around, seeming to realize for the first time how many people were watching and how many phones were recording. In that moment of hesitation, Judge Grayson spoke up, her judicial authority evident in every measured word. "Mr. Morrison, as an attorney, you should recognize when a position is legally untenable. I would strongly advise compliance with the captain's instructions. The combination of the captain's authority, the judge's legal weight, and the public scrutiny finally penetrated Gregory Morrison's rage. His shoulders slumped slightly. "Fine," he muttered. "But I'll be filing a formal complaint and speaking to my attorney about this harassment." "That is certainly your right," Thomas replied evenly, "just as it was Ms. Taylor's right to receive the service she purchased." James Wilson, the lead flight attendant, stepped forward. "We have 2 seats available in row 15. If you'll gather your belongings, I'll escort you there now." As the Morrisons reluctantly began collecting their things, Captain Ramirez turned to Jasmine. "Ms. Taylor, your original seat 2B is being restored to you. I apologize again for this experience, and I assure you that a full investigation will follow." Jasmine felt a wave of emotion, vindication relief, and a profound sense that justice was actually possible. "Thank you, Captain. And thank you to everyone who helped make this right." As the Morrisons were escorted to their new seats in the main cabin, a spontaneous round of applause broke out among the passengers who had witnessed the resolution. It wasn't just about a seat reassignment. It was about seeing fairness prevail, about witnessing a wrong being righted. Alex rushed forward to hug Jasmine. "You did it. You actually did it." Arthur Williams nodded approvingly. "Well done, young lady. Standing up for yourself with dignity and clarity, that's a skill that will serve you well throughout your life." As Jasmine prepared to take her rightful seat in 2B, Eleanor Grayson touched her arm gently. "Ms. Taylor, I don't normally do this, but I'd like to give you my card. If you ever consider a career in law, I'd be honored to mentor you. The legal profession needs voices like yours." Jasmine accepted the card with genuine gratitude, feeling as though the universe had somehow balanced itself. What had begun as an exercise in humiliation had transformed into a powerful lesson about advocacy, allyship, and the possibility of justice. As she finally settled into seat 2B, the spacious, comfortable, first-class seat she had worked so hard to afford, Jasmine couldn't help but think of her grandmother's words. "You go fly, baby, and you fly up front. Show them how it's done." She had done exactly that in more ways than one. The seatbelt sign had been off for 20 minutes, but the tension in the cabin continued to rise. Jasmine sat in seat 2B, finally where she belonged, but the atmosphere around her was electric with unresolved conflict. The Morrisons had been relocated to row 15, but their presence continued to cast a shadow over the flight. Gregory Morrison was not going quietly. From his new seat in the main cabin, his voice carried forward in angry bursts. "This is discrimination against paying customers," he shouted to no one in particular. "I want everyone's name. This will not stand." Elizabeth Morrison, seated beside him, vacillated between attempting to calm her husband and adding her own indignant comments. "Do they know who we are? This is how they treat loyal passengers." In first class, Jasmine tried to focus on the debate notes she had spread out on the ample tray table, but concentration was difficult. Part of her wanted to simply enjoy her rightful seat and ignore the drama, but another part remained unsettled. The injustice may have been corrected for her personally, but what about the larger issue? What about the next person? Margaret Wilson decided didn't belong in first class. Thomas Reynolds, the compliance auditor, was now seated across the aisle working intently on his laptop. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard as he documented every aspect of the incident in meticulous detail. Occasionally, he would glance up, observing the continued fallout with a professionally neutral expression. Judge Eleanor Grayson remained nearby, her presence a stabilizing force. She had been taking her own notes on her iPad, her years on the bench having taught her the value of contemporaneous documentation. "You're handling this remarkably well," she said quietly to Jasmine. "Many adults would have lost their composure long ago." Jasmine managed a small smile. "Debate team teaches you to stay focused under pressure. My coach says emotional control is as important as logical arguments." Wise Coach Eleanor nodded. "Though I imagine this wasn't the type of real-world application you expected." "Not exactly," Jasmine admitted. "But in a strange way, it's perfect preparation for my competition topic on barriers in contracts. I've just experienced firsthand how a perfectly valid agreement can be undermined by bias." As Jasmine and Judge Grayson conversed, the reactions throughout the cabin remained far from unanimous. The plane had become a microcosm of how society responds to injustice. "Just give them back their seats and let's get moving," called out a frustrated businessman from row 10. "I've got a meeting in New York in 3 hours. Why should they move?" countered a college student a few rows behind. "They didn't do anything wrong." A middle-aged woman with a southern accent spoke up hesitantly. "I feel bad for the girl, but is it really worth delaying everyone's flight over one seat?" An elderly man responded firmly. "If it were your granddaughter, would you want her to just accept being cheated?" The cabin crew exchanged worried glances as the passengers began taking sides. A flight attendant named Michael Rodriguez moved through the cabin quietly, trying to calm the more agitated passengers. "I understand everyone's frustration," he said to one group. "The captain is working to resolve this as quickly as possible." Their conversation was interrupted by another outburst from Gregory Morrison, who had now stood up in the aisle despite the flight attendant's requests to remain seated. "I'm not being silenced," he declared loudly. "This is an outrage. I paid for first class, and I demand to be treated with respect." Sofia Alvarez approached him with professional calm. "Sir, please return to your seat. You're disturbing other passengers." "I'm disturbing them." Gregory scoffed. "What about the disruption caused by rearranging the entire plane for one person? What about our rights?" The last question hung in the air, creating an opening that Captain Michael Ramirez, who had emerged from the cockpit to assess the situation, couldn't ignore. "Mr. Morrison," the captain said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone responsible for the safety of everyone on board. "Your rights as a passenger do not include occupying a seat that was improperly reassigned to you. Ms. Taylor had a confirmed reservation for seat 2B that was wrongfully taken from her. We have simply corrected that error." Gregory's face flushed a deeper shade of red. "This is about more than a seat assignment, and you know it. This is about special treatment." "You're right, that this is about more than a seat," Captain Ramirez replied evenly. "It's about contract integrity and fair treatment of all passengers. Now I must insist that you return to your seat, or we will have a more serious conversation about compliance with crew member instructions." When Gregory seemed ready to continue arguing, Captain Ramirez leaned in, slightly lowering his voice. "Look," he said, "I understand you're under enormous pressure. You mentioned you're representing a major client in a case that starts tomorrow morning. I get that you can't afford to be late or exhausted, but that doesn't give you the right to take someone else's seat." Gregory glanced at Elizabeth, then back at the captain. "You have to understand, in my position, everything depends on projecting success. First class isn't a luxury. It's expected. My clients wouldn't respect a lawyer who flies economy. And what about respecting a young woman's valid contract? Captain Ramirez asked. Gregory's expression hardened again. That's Margaret's problem, not mine. I just needed the seats. The momentary humanity vanished, replaced once more by entitlement. From his seat in row 8, Ben Foster, the documentary filmmaker, had been discreetly recording the exchange. As a visual storyteller, he recognized the powerful narrative unfolding: entitlement versus fairness, privilege versus rights. His camera captured Gregory Morrison's indignant posturing, the captain's measured authority, and the reactions of passengers around them. Several rows back, Alex Garcia had been providing updates to her social media followers. Update. The man who took Jasmine's seat is having a full meltdown in the aisle. Captain just shut him down. Justice. At altitude. Near the back of the plane, Arthur Williams was explaining the situation to curious passengers around him. The young lady worked for months to afford that first-class ticket. The gate agent gave her seat away without cause or compensation. It's a clear breach of contract, possibly with discriminatory intent. What had begun as one girl's individual problem had transformed into a collective story that everyone on the plane was now part of. Passengers who had initially been focused on their own journeys were now invested in the outcome of this impromptu morality play happening at 35,000 feet. Back in the cockpit, First Officer David Walker expressed concerns to Captain Ramirez when he returned. Michael, I understand the principle here, but we're already behind schedule. Operations is breathing down our necks about this delay. I'm aware, Captain Ramirez replied, checking the fuel calculations. Corporate will back the high-status passengers almost every time, Walker continued. You know how this works. We could both face disciplinary action over this. Ramirez met his gaze steadily. Then so be it. Some things matter more than on-time performance metrics. A crackle came over their headsets as dispatch radioed in. Flight 1108, be advised you're now showing a 30-minute delay. Please confirm reason for continued gate hold. Ramirez picked up the radio. Dispatch, this is Captain Ramirez. We're addressing a seating issue that involves a contract violation. I'll need another 15 minutes to resolve. Negative 1108. You're affecting network operations. Prepare for immediate departure or provide valid safety reason for delay. Ramirez took a deep breath. I'll take responsibility for the delay in my report. 15 minutes. He turned to Walker. Log it as a customer service delay my authorization. Walker nodded reluctantly. It's your command. Back in the main cabin, Gregory Morrison finally returned to his seat, but his voice continued to carry. This isn't over. I know people at the corporate level. There will be consequences. Elizabeth leaned across the aisle to another passenger. It's reverse discrimination, you know. They're only doing this because she's black and we're not. If the situations were reversed, no one would care. The passenger, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, looked at Elizabeth with barely disguised contempt. Or maybe they're doing it because she paid for a specific seat that was taken from her without cause. Why is that so hard to understand? Up in first class. Thomas Reynolds finished typing and closed his laptop. He turned to Jasmine with a serious expression. Ms. Taylor, I've documented everything, including the statement from Sofia confirming there was no mechanical issue with your original seat. I've also noted the gate override code that was used to reassign you, a code that should only be used for legitimate operational needs. What happens now? Jasmine asked. There will be a full investigation, Thomas explained. Margaret Wilson's actions appear to violate multiple company policies, possibly federal transportation regulations, and potentially anti-discrimination laws as well. Will she be fired? Jasmine wasn't sure how she felt about that possibility. She wanted accountability, but not necessarily retribution. Thomas chose his words carefully. That will depend on the findings of the investigation and her prior record. But at minimum, there will be consequences and corrective action. Judge Grayson interjected. The more immediate question is what remedy you're entitled to as the wronged party. At minimum, you should receive a full refund of your first-class fare given that you've experienced considerable distress even though your seating was eventually corrected. Thomas nodded in agreement. Judge Grayson is right. I've already noted in my report that you should receive complete compensation, and I've recommended additional consideration given the circumstances. Jasmine felt a mixture of emotions. On one hand, it was validating to have her grievance taken seriously and to know that there would be consequences for the wrongful treatment she'd experienced. On the other hand, she hadn't started this fight looking for compensation or punishment. She had simply wanted what she paid for and the dignity of being treated fairly. Before she could respond, a new commotion began in the main cabin. Gregory Morrison had stood again this time, addressing his fellow passengers directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced loudly, "I want to make you all aware of the injustice happening on this flight. My wife and I are platinum members who were legitimately assigned these seats. This entire situation is being blown out of proportion because of social media and political correctness." He gestured expansively. "If we don't reach New York on schedule, many of you will miss connections or important meetings, all because one person is making a scene over a seat assignment that can be resolved through proper channels after we land." His appeal was calculated to prioritize convenience over justice, a strategy that often worked in a society that valued comfort and efficiency. For a moment it seemed to be working as several passengers nodded in agreement. Then an unexpected voice responded, a middle-aged black woman in business attire from row 17. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and measured, "I've missed meetings before. I'll miss them again. But I've also spent my life watching people like that young lady being told to accept injustice for everyone else's convenience. Not today." Another voice joined in from across the aisle, a white man in his 60s. "I have a connection too, but some things are more important." She paid for that seat fair and square. The tide began to turn as more voices joined in support of Jasmine, though not unanimously. A tense division remained in the cabin, mirroring the larger societal struggles outside the aircraft. Gregory Morrison, realizing his attempt to rally support had backfired, returned to his seat. His face flushed with frustration. Elizabeth leaned close, whispering urgently, but their conversation was mercifully inaudible to the rest of the cabin. A collective sigh of relief passed through the plane. The immediate crisis appeared to be over, though the tension remained palpable. Captain Ramirez, still standing in the aisle, addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience during this unusual situation. We'll be continuing our service shortly, and we expect to arrive in New York on schedule despite these disruptions." As he turned to head back to the cockpit, he paused by Jasmine's seat. "Ms. Taylor, once again, I apologize for your experience today. I want you to know that I'll be personally filing a report about this incident to ensure it receives appropriate attention." "Thank you." Captain Jasmine replied, genuinely moved by his support. "I appreciate everything you've done to make this right." After the captain returned to the cockpit, Sofia approached with a fresh round of beverages for the first-class cabin. When she reached Jasmine, she leaned down with a warm smile. "Would you like anything to drink? Perhaps some ginger ale or a sparkling water?" "Ginger ale would be nice," Jasmine said, still feeling slightly overwhelmed by the dramatic turn her journey had taken. As Sofia prepared the drink, she spoke quietly. "You know, in 15 years of flying, I've never seen anything quite like this. The way you stood up for yourself, with such dignity and clarity, it was impressive." "I was terrified," Jasmine admitted. "I'm still not sure how all this happened. It happened because you knew your rights and weren't afraid to assert them," Sofia replied, handing her the glass. "And because good people recognized an injustice and stepped forward to help correct it. Both parts matter." After Sofia moved on, a senior flight attendant pulled her aside in the galley. "You're putting yourself in a difficult position," he warned quietly. "Margaret Wilson has friends in management. Getting involved in passenger disputes isn't worth risking your career. Sofia's hand stilled on the beverage cart she was preparing. Jose, you've been flying for 20 years. Have you ever seen something like this and just looked the other way? He hesitated. More times than I want to admit. That's how the system works. Maybe it shouldn't, Sofia replied. Maybe that's the problem. Jose studied her for a moment. Just be careful. People like the Morrisons make complaints that stick. People like that young lady rarely have the same power. Sofia nodded, understanding the risk she was taking. That's exactly why I can't stay quiet. If people with some protection won't speak up, who will? Back in first class? Judge Grayson turned to Jasmine. She's right, you know. Many injustices persist not because there aren't rules against them, but because people feel too intimidated to invoke those rules, or because witnesses remain silent. I almost didn't say anything, Jasmine confessed. When Margaret threatened to call security, I seriously considered just accepting the new seat and staying quiet. That's exactly what she was counting on, Thomas Reynolds said from across the aisle. It's a common tactic, using the threat of authority to discourage legitimate complaints, especially from those who might be particularly vulnerable to such threats. Like a 17-year-old black girl traveling alone, Jasmine said quietly. Exactly. Thomas nodded. She calculated that you would be easier to intimidate than the Morrisons, who she likely assumed had more social capital to challenge her decisions. But she miscalculated, Judge Grayson added with a small smile. She didn't realize you had the intelligence and courage to stand up for yourself, or that you would find allies. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged on as the plane encountered some mild turbulence. As Jasmine secured her belt, she looked out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below. Just hours ago, she had been excited simply to be flying for the first time. Now she was in the middle of what felt like a case study in social justice and contract rights. The turbulence passed and the seatbelt sign dinged off again. As if on cue, Alex appeared from the main cabin, having convinced a flight attendant to let her visit Jasmine briefly. Everyone back there is talking about what happened, she reported excitedly. You're like a hero to half the plane right now. People are posting about it on social media with hashtags like #JusticeInTheAir and #FirstClassIntegrity. Jasmine felt her cheeks warm. I didn't do this for attention. I know Alex assured her. That's what makes it even more powerful. You stood up for a basic principle, that a contract should be honored regardless of who the customer is. People respond to that because deep down everyone wants to believe that fairness is possible. Before Alex could say more, James Wilson approached. I'm sorry, but you'll need to return to your assigned seat now. We're preparing for another round of service. Of course, Alex said. I'll text you later, Jasmine. As Alex made her way back to the main cabin, Jasmine noticed that many passengers smiled or nodded at her friend as she passed. The story had clearly spread throughout the plane, creating an unusual sense of community among strangers who would normally ignore each other for the duration of the flight. In row 15, the Morrisons sat in stony silence, isolated in their indignation. Gregory stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, while Elizabeth scrolled aggressively through her phone, periodically typing what appeared to be angry messages. In stark contrast to their isolation, Jasmine found herself at the center of an impromptu support network. Thomas Reynolds continued to document the incident with professional thoroughness. Judge Grayson offered wisdom from her decades of legal experience. Sofia and the other flight attendants provided attentive service that felt like a silent apology for her earlier treatment. Even passengers Jasmine had never spoken to found ways to express their solidarity. A thumbs up from across the aisle, an encouraging nod as they passed by on the way to the restroom, a napkin passed to her with "Good for you" scribbled on it. For Jasmine, who had grown up in a world where justice often seemed more theoretical than practical, the experience was transformative. She had always believed in the power of reasoned arguments and evidence. That was why she had joined the debate team in the first place. But seeing those principles actually work in real life, witnessing fairness prevail not in a classroom exercise, but in a real-world conflict, gave her a new sense of possibility. The revelation of air marshals on board seemed to finally deflate Gregory Morrison's belligerence. He sat rigidly in his row 15 seat, Elizabeth whispering furiously beside him. Both of them now acutely aware that their actions had escalated a seating dispute into a potential security incident. Throughout the cabin, passengers exchanged meaningful glances. The presence of air marshals had transformed what was already a tense situation into something that felt genuinely significant. This was no longer just about a seat assignment. It had become about fundamental concepts of fairness, respect, and the abuse of privilege. In first class, Jasmine sat quietly still, processing the series of events that had turned her first flight into an impromptu lesson in standing up for justice. She hadn't asked for any of this. All she had wanted was to fly to her debate competition in the seat she had paid for the seat she had worked extra jobs for 6 months to afford. Thomas Reynolds looked up from his laptop. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern. "I think so," Jasmine replied. "It's just a lot to take in. I never expected my first flight to be quite this eventful." Judge Grayson's expression softened. "You've handled yourself with remarkable poise throughout this ordeal. Many adults wouldn't have shown the same composure. My debate coach always says that the most powerful position is one of calm certainty," Jasmine explained. "Anger might feel satisfying in the moment, but it rarely persuades anyone. Your coach is very wise." Thomas nodded. "And you've applied that principle admirably today." The flight continued for another 30 minutes without incident. The air marshals maintained their vigilant presence. The Morrisons remained sullen but quiet, and the rest of the passengers settled into an uneasy peace. Then, with approximately 1 hour left before landing, Captain Michael Ramirez's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I apologize for the interruption, but I've made a decision that I feel I should explain to everyone on board. As the commanding officer of this aircraft, my primary responsibility is the safety and well-being of all passengers. However, I also have a duty to ensure that our company's policies regarding fair and equal treatment are upheld." The cabin fell silent as everyone listened intently. Earlier today, Captain Ramirez continued a passenger on this flight, Ms. Jasmine Taylor, experienced what appears to be a serious breach of our contract of carriage when her confirmed first-class seat was improperly reassigned without cause or compensation. While we've corrected the immediate issue by restoring Ms. Taylor to her rightful seat, I believe the matter requires more formal attention. Jasmine felt every eye in the cabin turn toward her. Her cheeks warmed, but she sat up straighter, maintaining the dignified composure she had exhibited throughout the ordeal. Therefore, the captain went on, "I've made the decision to initiate a formal captain's report regarding this incident, which will trigger an automatic investigation at the corporate level. Additionally, I've requested that a customer advocacy representative meet our flight upon arrival at LaGuardia to speak directly with Ms. Taylor and document her experience." Gregory Morrison's voice cut through the cabin. "This is outrageous special treatment for one passenger while the rest of us are treated like criminals." An air marshal took a step toward row 15, but it wasn't necessary. From throughout the cabin, voices rose in opposition to Morrison's complaint. She paid for her seat. Someone called out, "You're the one who caused all this trouble," added another. A woman a few rows behind the Morrisons stood up. "Sir, I've been on this flight since Dallas, and the only person receiving special treatment was you when the gate agent gave you someone else's seat." The spontaneous defense from fellow passengers seemed to catch Gregory off guard. He had clearly expected at least some support for his position, but instead found himself increasingly isolated. Captain Ramirez waited for the cabin to quiet before continuing. "I understand this situation has created discomfort for many of you, and I apologize for that. However, I believe that addressing injustice directly rather than looking the other way for the sake of convenience is always the right choice. Thank you for your patience and understanding. We'll be beginning our descent into New York in approximately 45 minutes. As the announcement ended, a ripple of conversation spread through the cabin. Many passengers were discussing what they had witnessed and sharing their perspectives on the situation. In first class, Sofia Alvarez approached Jasmine with a gentle smile. "The captain would like to speak with you for a moment if you're comfortable with that. He's just outside the cockpit." Jasmine nodded and rose from her seat. As she walked to the front of the plane, she noticed something remarkable. Passengers were smiling at her, nodding encouragingly, even reaching out to touch her arm in silent support as she passed. Captain Ramirez stood waiting by the forward galley. In person, he was a man of medium height, with kind eyes and the confident bearing that came from decades of command. "Ms. Taylor," he said quietly, "I wanted to check on you personally. This has been quite an ordeal, and I want to ensure you're doing all right." "I'm okay," Captain Jasmine assured him. "Thank you for everything you've done." "I've been flying for 27 years, Captain Ramirez said, shaking his head slightly, "and I've seen my share of passenger disputes. But what happened to you today wasn't just a misunderstanding or a service failure. It appears to have been a deliberate violation of our most basic obligation to honor the contracts we make with our passengers." "I appreciate you taking it seriously," Jasmine said. "For a while there at the gate, I thought no one would believe me or care what happened." Captain Ramirez's expression grew serious. "Unfortunately, that calculation, the assumption that certain passengers won't speak up or won't be believed if they do, is exactly what enables bad actors like Margaret Wilson to abuse their authority, which is why it's so important that you did speak up." From somewhere in the main cabin, Gregory Morrison's voice rose again, though his exact words were mercifully inaudible at the front of the plane. Captain Ramirez sighed. "I should get back to the cockpit to prepare for our approach to New York. But I wanted you to know that what happened today matters not just for you, but for every passenger who deserves to be treated with dignity and to receive the service they've paid for." "Thank you," Captain Jasmine said, genuinely moved. "This means a lot to me." As Jasmine returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted yet again. The initial shock and tension had given way to something else, a sense of collective purpose of witnesses to an important moment. Ben Foster, the documentary filmmaker, was now openly filming, having received permission from several passengers to include them in what he was calling an important record of everyday justice in action. His camera captured the supportive glances directed at Jasmine, the isolated bubble of hostility surrounding the Morrisons, and the attentive presence of the air marshals. In row 22, a group of college students had started a discussion about consumer rights and discrimination in service industries inspired directly by what they were witnessing. "It's not just about a seat," one young woman was saying. "It's about the assumption that certain people don't belong in certain spaces, and how that assumption gets enforced through 1,000 small decisions every day." Her companions nodded thoughtfully, the real-world example unfolding before them far more compelling than any textbook case study. Near the back of the plane, Alex had become something of an information hub, sharing updates with those who couldn't see what was happening up front. Her clear explanations and passionate advocacy for her new friend had earned her the respect of the passengers around her. "Jasmine's not just fighting for her seat," she explained to an elderly couple who had asked for details. "She's fighting for the principle that a contract should mean the same thing regardless of who's holding it." The woman nodded approvingly. "In my day, we called that fighting for our rights. Good for her." As the plane began its initial descent toward New York, the seatbelt sign dinged on and passengers began preparing for landing. The ritual of stowing tray tables and returning seats to their upright positions created a brief pause in the drama that had consumed the flight. In that moment of relative calm, Elizabeth Morrison made an unexpected move. She rose from her seat in row 15 and made her way forward, ignoring her husband's hissed objections. Her destination, remarkably, was Jasmine's seat in first class. The air marshals tensed, watching carefully, but Elizabeth's body language wasn't aggressive. If anything, she seemed nervous, her usual confidence replaced by hesitation. When she reached the boundary between main cabin and first class, she paused, then spoke directly to Jasmine. "I feel I should apologize," she said, her voice strained but clear enough to be heard by those nearby. "This situation got out of hand, and I want you to know that I didn't intend for things to happen this way." The cabin went silent, everyone straining to hear this unexpected development. Jasmine looked at Elizabeth steadily, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology yet. When we arrived late at the gate, Elizabeth continued. "Margaret told us she could get us into first class if we made it worth her while. We've done it before on other flights. I didn't ask whose seats they were. I didn't think about who might be affected. I just wanted the comfortable seats I felt we deserved." From row 15, Gregory's voice carried forward. "Elizabeth, what are you doing? Get back here immediately." Elizabeth flinched, but didn't turn around. "It's not that we thought you shouldn't have a nice seat," she continued, discomfort evident in her expression. "We just didn't think about it at all. Margaret has helped us before, and we were running late. So it didn't matter whose seat it was?" Jasmine asked quietly. Elizabeth flinched slightly. "We didn't ask. I guess we didn't want to know." She lowered her voice further. "I never meant to. I mean, this had nothing to do with you being what Mrs. Morrison." Jasmine asked, her voice calm but firm. Elizabeth couldn't complete the sentence, revealing the limits of her self-awareness. "I'm sorry," she said again, then hurried back to her seat. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of the injustice or its implications, but rather the beginning of an uncomfortable realization, a small crack in a lifetime of privilege that might with time and reflection lead to greater understanding. The revelation hung in the air, a confession of what many had suspected but couldn't prove. Margaret Wilson hadn't just made a mistake. She had engaged in a pattern of selling seat upgrades outside the official system, taking payments to give certain passengers preferential treatment at the expense of others. Thomas Reynolds was already typing rapidly, adding this new information to his report. "That's an admission of bribery," he said quietly to Jasmine. "It changes everything about the investigation." Judge Grayson nodded gravely. "And the mention that they've done it before suggests this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern of behavior." Jasmine sat silent for a moment, processing Elizabeth's unexpected apology and confession. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of the harm done. Elizabeth had apologized for the situation, getting out of hand, not for the fundamental injustice of taking someone else's seat. But it was still significant. "Do you think she's just trying to save herself now that she sees how much trouble they might be in?" Jasmine asked Judge Grayson. "Perhaps," Eleanor replied thoughtfully. "But even self-interested honesty has value. Her testimony could help prevent this from happening to others in the future." In the main cabin, Gregory Morrison had moved beyond rage into something colder and more calculating. Leaning across the aisle to a sympathetic-looking businessman, he spoke just loud enough to be heard by several rows. "This is going to be an expensive lesson for the airline," he said. "When my law firm files suit for harassment and public humiliation, they'll regret how they've treated us today." The businessman, previously neutral, now looked uncomfortable. "You might want to reconsider that given what your wife just admitted." Elizabeth was confused. Gregory replied dismissively. "Overwhelmed by the situation, her statement won't hold up." "It was recorded by at least a dozen passengers," the businessman pointed out, "including me." Gregory's face flushed again, but before he could respond, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into LaGuardia Airport. All electronic devices should now be stowed tray tables up and seats in their upright position. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." as the plane descended toward New York City. Jasmine gazed out the window at the sprawling metropolis below. The iconic Manhattan skyline came into view, her first glimpse of the city she'd dreamed of visiting. Despite everything that had happened, a flutter of excitement rose in her chest. She was here. She had made it, and against all odds, she was sitting exactly where she belonged. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, followed by the roar of reverse thrusters. As they taxied toward the gate, Captain Ramirez made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to LaGuardia Airport. Local time is 2:45 p.m. and the temperature is a pleasant 72 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." He paused before adding, "Before we part ways, I want to thank all of you for your patience during what has been an unusual flight. I also want to acknowledge something important that I witnessed today, the power of individuals standing up for what's right and of a community coming together to support fairness and dignity. Travel can sometimes bring out the worst in people, but today I saw it bring out the best in many of you. Thank you for that." As the plane pulled up to the gate, Jasmine could see through the window that something unusual was happening. Instead of just the regular ground crew, there was a small group of people in business attire waiting on the jet bridge, including one woman holding a sign with Taylor written on it. "Looks like the customer advocacy representative the captain mentioned is already here," Thomas Reynolds observed, "along with what appears to be someone from corporate communications and possibly legal." "They're taking this very seriously," Judge Grayson noted with approval. "As they should." The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the familiar chaos of deplaning began, passengers standing to retrieve bags from overhead bins forming an impatient queue in the aisle, all eager to exit after the tense flight. But something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual rush to be first off the plane, several passengers paused by Jasmine's seat, offering words of support and encouragement. "You stood up for all of us today," an older man said, briefly touching her shoulder. "Don't let anyone tell you where you belong," added a woman in business attire. "You belong wherever you've earned the right to be." A college-aged passenger stopped to say, "I recorded everything. If you need it for the investigation, just let me know," before passing her a slip of paper with contact information. Even more remarkably, as the deplaning continued, passengers began allowing Jasmine to go ahead of them, a small but meaningful gesture of respect. What would normally have been a long wait as a first-class passenger for the entire main cabin to deplane became a relatively quick exit as the unspoken consensus emerged that Jasmine should be allowed to leave the aircraft promptly. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the waiting airline representatives approached her immediately. "Ms. Taylor," said the woman holding the sign, "I'm Diane Rodriguez from Customer Advocacy. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for your experience today and ensure that your concerns are addressed fully and fairly." The corporate response had begun. But something more meaningful had already taken place on that flight. A demonstration that when faced with injustice, individuals could still stand up, allies could still emerge, and a community could still come together to say, "This is not acceptable." As Jasmine prepared to leave the airport and head to her debate competition, she carried with her not just the memory of a difficult experience, but a powerful lesson in advocacy and allyship. Her topic on barriers and contracts had come vividly to life, and she now had a compelling personal perspective to bring to her arguments. In the terminal, Alex caught up with her phone in hand, eyes wide with excitement. "Jasmine, this thing is blowing up online. People on the plane have been posting about what happened, and it's already getting thousands of shares. Justice in the air is trending." Jasmine looked at the phone screen, momentarily overwhelmed by the realization that her private ordeal had become a public story. Part of her was uncomfortable with the attention, but another part recognized the potential impact. If sharing her experience could help prevent similar situations in the future, perhaps the difficulty had been worth it. I guess I have a real-world example for my debate now, she said with a small smile. Pretty sure no one else will have evidence this fresh. Alex laughed. You're going to crush the competition, and I'll be cheering you on the whole way. As they walked together toward the baggage claim, Jasmine reflected on her grandmother's words that had started this journey. You go fly, baby, and you fly up front. Show them how it's done. She had certainly done that in more ways than one. The moment Jasmine Taylor stepped from the jet bridge into the LaGuardia terminal, she was met by a team of airline representatives who had clearly been awaiting her arrival with focused urgency. In addition to Diane Rodriguez from Customer Advocacy, there was a distinguished man in a tailored suit who introduced himself as Daniel Parker, Vice President of Passenger Experience, and a younger woman named Melissa Santos from the legal department. Ms. Taylor. Daniel Parker began his tone respectful, despite Jasmine's youth. I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. We've received a preliminary report from Captain Ramirez and Mr. Reynolds, and what they've described is completely unacceptable and contrary to everything our airline stands for. Jasmine, still processing the whirlwind events of the past few hours, nodded her appreciation but remained cautious. Thank you. It was difficult. We understand that's an understatement, Diane Rodriguez said kindly. We've arranged a private room where we can discuss what happened and how we plan to address it if you're comfortable with that. Before Jasmine could respond, Judge Eleanor Grayson emerged from the jet bridge behind her, followed closely by Thomas Reynolds. They had clearly coordinated to ensure Jasmine wasn't alone for these discussions. Ms. Taylor, Judge Grayson said, if you'd like an independent party present for your conversation with the airline representatives, I'd be happy to accompany you. As would I, Thomas added. In my role as compliance auditor, I'm actually required to follow up on incidents of this nature. The airline executives exchanged glances, clearly recognizing Judge Grayson from her years on the federal bench. Her presence instantly changed the dynamic of the interaction. Of course, Daniel Parker said quickly. Judge Grayson, Mr. Reynolds, we welcome your participation and perspective. At that moment, a commotion erupted behind them as Gregory and Elizabeth Morrison emerged from the jet bridge flanked by airport security officers. Gregory was still protesting loudly, his face flushed with indignation. This is an outrage. I've been a platinum member for 15 years. You can't treat us like criminals. The security officers maintained professional composure, neither engaging with nor restraining him, simply ensuring he proceeded through the terminal without further disrupting operations. One of the officers approached Daniel Parker. Sir, as requested by Captain Ramirez, we're escorting these passengers to meet with the Port Authority Police Department representatives. They want to take statements regarding the in-flight disturbance. Gregory Morrison overheard this and exploded again. Police, this is absurd. We're the victims here. I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately. As the Morrisons were led away, still protesting, more passengers began emerging from the flight. Many nodded supportively to Jasmine as they passed, some even stopping briefly to offer words of encouragement. You stood up for all of us, said an elderly woman, briefly touching Jasmine's arm. Don't let them minimize what happened, added a businessman in a crisp suit. I've got the whole thing on video if you need it. Alex Garcia burst through the crowd, her energy undiminished by the tense flight. Jasmine, there you are. I was worried they'd whisk you away before I could say goodbye properly. She wrapped Jasmine in a quick hug, then stepped back with a serious expression. I put all my contact info in your phone. Remember, I want a full report on how your debate goes, and I'll testify about what happened today if you need me to. Thank you, Alex, Jasmine said, genuinely moved by the support from someone who had been a complete stranger just hours ago. For everything. As Alex headed off to catch her connecting flight, Arthur Williams approached, moving carefully with his cane. Ms. Taylor, it was an honor to witness your courage today. If an old accountant's testimony would be helpful in sorting this out, you have my card. The stream of supportive passengers continued creating an unusual scene in the busy terminal, a spontaneous community of witnesses and allies forming around one young woman who had simply stood up for what was right. Eventually, Jasmine, Judge Grayson, and Thomas Reynolds followed the airline representatives to a private meeting room near the airline's customer service center. The space was comfortable but businesslike, with a conference table, water pitchers, and notepads at each seat. Daniel Parker began once everyone was seated. "Ms. Taylor, we'd like to hear your complete account of what happened today in your own words. After that, we want to explain the immediate steps we're taking to address this situation and make things right for you." Jasmine took a deep breath and recounted her experience from the beginning. Her months of extra work to afford the first-class ticket, her excitement about the trip, Margaret Wilson's sudden decision to reassign her seat, the torn boarding pass, the threat of security involvement, and everything that followed on the plane. Throughout her account, she remained remarkably composed, presenting the facts clearly and directly, without embellishment or excessive emotion. The skills honed through years of debate competition serving her well in this real-world moment of advocacy. Judge Grayson and Thomas Reynolds occasionally added context or clarification, particularly regarding the legal and policy implications of what had occurred, but mostly they allowed Jasmine to tell her own story. When she finished, there was a moment of heavy silence in the room. Then Melissa Santos, the legal representative, spoke for the first time. "Ms. Taylor, what you've described is not just a customer service failure. It potentially constitutes several violations of both company policy and federal transportation regulations regarding equitable treatment of passengers and fraudulent manipulation of seating assignments. The fact that you were threatened with security involvement when attempting to assert your legitimate contractual rights is particularly troubling." Daniel Parker nodded gravely. "Based on the captain's report, Mr. Reynolds' documentation, and your account, we've already taken several immediate actions. Margaret Wilson has been suspended pending a full investigation, and we're reviewing all complaints related to her conduct over the past year to identify any pattern of similar incidents. We've also initiated an immediate refund of your entire ticket price," Diane Rodriguez added. "You will still be flying first class on your return journey, but at no cost to you. Additionally, we'd like to offer you flight vouchers to cover future travel needs, including any competitions or college visits you might have coming up." Jasmine appreciated the concrete response, but had more fundamental concerns. What about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else? What if the next person doesn't have a judge and an auditor to help them? Or what if they're too intimidated to speak up at all? Daniel Parker seemed impressed by her focus on the structural issue rather than personal compensation. "That's an excellent point, and it's why we're also implementing a system-wide review of our gate override protocols. Effective immediately, any involuntary seat reassignment must be documented with specific cause approved by a supervisor and accompanied by appropriate compensation documentation for the affected passenger. Additionally," Melissa Santos added, "we're revising our training for all customer-facing staff to emphasize that threats of security involvement should never be used to intimidate passengers who are asserting legitimate concerns." Judge Grayson had been observing the airline's response carefully. "These all sound like positive steps, but I'm curious about accountability. Ms. Wilson's actions weren't just a momentary lapse in judgment. They represented a fundamental breach of trust with your customers. How will you ensure that such breaches have appropriate consequences?" Daniel Parker met her gaze directly. "You're absolutely right, Your Honor. While I can't discuss specific personnel matters, I can tell you that our investigation will be thorough, and if the allegations are confirmed, the consequences will reflect the seriousness of the breach. We're also implementing a new whistleblower channel for employees to report similar misconduct they may witness." Throughout the discussion, Thomas Reynolds had been making notes on his laptop. Now he looked up. "There's also the matter of the Morrisons' statement on the plane that they had done this before, with Margaret Wilson suggesting an ongoing improper arrangement. That will need to be part of the investigation as well." "It already is," Melissa confirmed. We take allegations of staff accepting payments for preferential treatment extremely seriously. It undermines the integrity of our entire operation." As the meeting continued, Jasmine found herself in an unexpected position. At the center of a corporate response to injustice, her voice being heard and respected by executives who might normally never interact with a 17-year-old from Houston. The debate skills she had worked so hard to develop were serving her well in this real-world negotiation. After about 45 minutes of detailed discussion, Daniel Parker shifted to more immediate concerns. "Ms. Taylor, you mentioned you're here for a debate competition. When does that begin?" "Tomorrow morning," Jasmine replied. "My team is already at the hotel. I was planning to take a taxi there after this." "We've arranged for a car service to take you directly to your hotel," Diane Rodriguez said, "and we'd be happy to extend the same service for your return to the airport." As the meeting concluded, everyone exchanged contact information with promises of follow-up communications as the investigation progressed. Before they parted ways, Judge Grayson pulled Jasmine aside for a private word. "You handled yourself beautifully in there," she said, her expression warm with approval. Many adults with years of professional experience wouldn't have navigated that conversation with the same clarity and focus. "I was nervous," Jasmine admitted. "These are powerful people making decisions that could affect a lot of other passengers." "Exactly," Eleanor nodded. "And you kept the focus on those broader implications, rather than just your personal inconvenience. That's the mark of true advocacy." She handed Jasmine a business card with a personal email address handwritten on the back. "I meant what I said on the plane. If you ever consider a career in law, I'd be honored to provide whatever guidance or support I can. The legal profession needs minds like yours. People who can see beyond the letter of a contract to the human impact of how it's enforced." Thomas Reynolds approached to say his goodbyes as well. "I'll be submitting my full report today, and I've included your contact information for follow-up. What happened to you matters not just for your own situation, but as an example of issues that need addressing across the industry." As Jasmine finally left the meeting room, accompanied by Diane Rodriguez, who would escort her to the waiting car service, she was surprised to find several more passengers from the flight still waiting in the terminal area. They approached as she emerged, offering supportive words, business cards, and, in some cases, digital evidence they had captured of the incident. Ben Foster, the documentary filmmaker, stepped forward. "Ms. Taylor, I'm Ben Foster. I documented much of what happened on the flight. I'd like to offer you the footage, no strings attached. You can use it however you see fit for any complaint or follow-up." "Thank you," Jasmine said, somewhat overwhelmed by the continued support. "I appreciate that." "What happened today mattered," Ben said simply. "Not just to you, but to everyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder that standing up for what's right isn't just an abstract concept. It's a choice we make in real moments with real consequences." As Jasmine finally made her way toward the exit, she reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past several hours. What had begun as a simple desire to fly comfortably to her debate competition had transformed into a lesson in advocacy, allyship, and the power of principled resistance to injustice. The black car was waiting, as promised, the driver holding a sign with Taylor printed on it. As she settled into the comfortable back seat and the car pulled away from the terminal, Jasmine took a moment to text her parents, letting them know she had arrived safely and had quite a story to tell when they spoke later. Then she opened her debate notes, reviewing her arguments on barriers in contracts with fresh insight. She had come to New York seeking a championship. She hadn't expected to also find her voice as an advocate for justice in the most unexpected of settings. 35,000 feet above the ground in Seat 2B. The morning sun streamed through the hotel room window, casting long rectangles of light across Jasmine's carefully laid-out clothes, her debate uniform of a navy blue blazer, crisp white blouse, and charcoal skirt. She had been awake since 5 a.m., her mind too active with thoughts of both the upcoming competition and the previous day's extraordinary events to allow for much sleep. Her phone buzzed with another notification. Since landing in New York, her social media accounts had exploded with messages, friend requests, and tags in posts about what people were now calling "justice in the air." The video taken by Ben Foster and clips recorded by other passengers had begun circulating online, gathering hundreds of thousands of views overnight. Jasmine had mostly avoided engaging with the sudden attention, focusing instead on preparing for the debate championship that had brought her to New York in the first place. After all the work she'd done to get here, not just the extra jobs to afford the flight, but the countless hours of research practice and preparation for the competition itself, she wasn't about to let anything, even viral fame, distract her from her purpose. The night before her competition, Jasmine sat in her hotel room revising her debate notes with fresh insight. She created a new section titled "Practical Barriers to Contract Enforcement" and listed the obstacles she had encountered. Information asymmetry, gate agents' false claim about mechanical issues, intimidation tactics, threat of security involvement, power imbalance, solo teenage traveler versus airline authority figure, social capital disparities, Morrison's platinum status versus her first-time flyer status, procedural hurdles, no clear appeals process at the gate. She then developed counter-strategies for each barrier based on her experience. Documentation, screenshots, receipts, contemporaneous notes, knowledge of rights, specific contract terms and regulations, strategic allies, identifying authority figures who can intervene, public transparency, witnesses and documentation of violations, persistence despite discomfort, not accepting unjust outcomes. As she worked, Jasmine realized she wasn't just preparing for a debate competition anymore. She was developing a practical framework for navigating an unequal system, tools that others could use in similar situations. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Ms. Patterson, her debate coach, who had flown in with the rest of the team 2 days earlier. "Ready for the big day?" Ms. Patterson asked as Jasmine let her in. A woman in her early 40s with keen eyes and a strategic mind, she had been a champion debater herself in her college days. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jasmine replied, gathering her materials into her portfolio case. Ms. Patterson studied her carefully. "How are you really doing after everything that happened yesterday? The whole team's been talking about it. It's all over social media." Jasmine paused, considering the question honestly. "It's strange. Part of me wishes none of it had happened, that I could have just had a normal, quiet first flight experience. But another part of me feels, I don't know, fortified somehow, like I've been tested and found out I'm stronger than I realized." Ms. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "That makes perfect sense. And if I may say so, your topic on barriers and contracts just became a lot more compelling with your first-hand experience." "I've been thinking about that," Jasmine admitted, "about how I might incorporate what happened into my arguments without making it seem like I'm just telling a personal story. The best arguments often connect universal principles to lived experience," Ms. Patterson reminded her. "It's not about making the audience feel sorry for you. It's about illuminating the real-world impact of abstract concepts." They made their way down to the hotel lobby where the rest of the East Ridge High debate team was waiting. 4 other students who had qualified in various categories for the national championship. "There she is," exclaimed Deshawn, the team captain. "Our viral sensation." Jasmine rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Please don't. I'm nervous enough about the competition without thinking about all that." "Seriously, though," said Mia, who specialized in Lincoln Douglas debate. "What you did was amazing. Standing up to that gate agent and then those entitled passengers, that took real courage." "I just wanted what I paid for," Jasmine said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less. And that's exactly what makes it so powerful," Ms. Patterson interjected. "You weren't asking for special treatment. You were asking for the basic respect of having a contract honored." As they walked the few blocks to Columbia University where the National Youth Forensics Championship was being held, Jasmine tried to shift her focus fully to the competition ahead. Today would feature preliminary rounds in all categories with finals scheduled for tomorrow. If she performed well in her 3 preliminary rounds, she would advance to the semifinal and potentially the final round. The campus was bustling with activity. Hundreds of high school students from across the country gathered for the prestigious competition. Teams huddled in corners reviewing notes and practicing arguments. Judges, mostly college debate coaches and communication professors, moved between rooms with clipboards and evaluation forms. Jasmine checked the schedule posted on a large board in the main hall. Her first round would begin at 10:30 a.m. in Hamilton Hall Room 302. Her opponents would be from Phillips Academy, Andover, a prestigious boarding school with a nationally ranked debate program. "Tough draw for the first round," Deshawn noted, looking over her shoulder. "Andover's policy team took second place last year." "Good," Jasmine said with quiet determination. "Better to face the strongest opponents early." As she found a quiet corner to review her notes one last time, she was approached by a familiar face, Alexandra Garcia, her seatmate from the flight. "Jasmine," Alex exclaimed, giving her a quick hug. "I was hoping I'd find you before the round started. How are you doing after everything yesterday?" "I'm good," Jasmine assured her. "Just trying to focus on the competition now." "Of course," Alex nodded. "But I thought you should know. Your story is everywhere. #justice. In the Air is trending nationally. That video Ben took has over 1 million views already." Jasmine's eyes widened. 1 million? That's overwhelming. "It's resonating with people because it's about something fundamental, being treated with dignity and having your rights respected," Alex said. "And you handled it all with such poise." Before they could talk further, an announcement came over the PA system. All competitors for round 1 should now proceed to their assigned rooms. Judges are in place and ready to begin. "That's me," Jasmine said, gathering her materials. "What category are you in again?" "Lincoln Douglas Room 215, Alex replied. "Good luck in your round. I want to hear all about it later." As Jasmine made her way to room 302, she felt a familiar mix of nervousness and excitement. This was what she had worked for all year, the chance to test her skills against the best young debaters in the country. The room was arranged formally with tables at the front for the debaters and rows of seats for observers and judges. Her opponents from Andover, a boy and girl in matching blazers, were already setting up their materials. 3 judges sat in the front row reviewing their evaluation criteria. Ms. Patterson gave Jasmine a reassuring nod from the back of the room as she took her position at the affirmative table. As the only qualifier in policy debate from East Ridge High, Jasmine would be debating solo against Andover's 2-person team, a significant disadvantage in a format typically designed for partnerships. The moderator welcomed everyone and explained the rules. The resolution for debate was, "In the United States, contract law inadequately protects vulnerable populations from predatory agreements." As the affirmative speaker, Jasmine would present, first establishing her position and laying out her key arguments. Then would come cross-examination rebuttals and closing arguments, a structured intellectual battle that would test not just her knowledge but her ability to think on her feet and respond to unexpected challenges. During her debate, Jasmine incorporated legal theory that transformed her personal experience into a compelling academic argument. "Contract theory presumes equal bargaining power and good faith enforcement," she explained to the judges. "But in reality, what scholars call discretionary enforcement points create opportunities for bias to enter the system. These are moments when an individual gatekeeper decides whether to strictly enforce contract terms, bend them, or ignore them altogether." She referenced legal scholars who had documented patterns of unequal contract enforcement in housing lending and employment contexts. What makes these barriers particularly insidious is their invisibility in the contract itself. Nothing in the airline's contract of carriage says terms may be enforced differently based on the customer's perceived status. Yet research consistently shows that discretionary enforcement creates disparate outcomes. Her Andover opponents tried to counter by arguing for personal responsibility and contract literacy, but Jasmine was prepared. Contract literacy is indeed vital, she acknowledged. But even perfect knowledge of one's contractual rights becomes meaningless when enforcement mechanisms are selectively applied. The real barrier isn't in the text of agreements, but in the human systems that interpret and enforce them. When the moderator signaled for her to begin, Jasmine stood, took a deep breath, and stepped to the center of the room. For a brief moment, memories of the previous day flashed through her mind. Margaret Wilson tearing her boarding pass, the Morrisons' entitlement, the support of strangers who became allies. Then, with remarkable clarity, she began to speak. Yesterday, I experienced firsthand what happens when contract enforcement becomes selective and arbitrary. I had a confirmed reservation for a first-class airline seat that I worked multiple jobs for 6 months to afford. Despite having fulfilled every requirement of the contract, payment check-in, appropriate documentation, my seat was taken from me without cause or compensation, given to passengers deemed more worthy by a gatekeeper who never questioned their belonging in that space. The room was utterly silent. Even her Andover opponents were watching with rapt attention. This is not merely an anecdote. It illustrates a fundamental problem in how contracts function in America today. On paper, contract law appears neutral, offering the same protections to all parties who enter into agreements. But in practice, the enforcement of those contracts is often anything but neutral. With growing confidence, Jasmine laid out her argument, connecting her personal experience to broader patterns of inequitable contract enforcement across housing, employment, consumer agreements, and other domains. She cited research showing how identical contract violations were treated differently depending on the race, age, or socioeconomic status of the person asserting their rights. The issue is not just the letter of the law, she continued, but the 1,000 small moments of discretion where gatekeepers decide whose contractual rights matter and whose can be dismissed. The problem is not just in the agreements themselves, but in the barriers to their equitable enforcement. For 15 minutes, she built her case methodically, her voice clear and compelling. The judges were taking extensive notes, occasionally nodding at particularly strong points. Even her opponents seemed impressed by the unusual power of her presentation. When she concluded her opening argument, there was a moment of silence before the moderator called for the cross-examination phase to begin. The male debater from Andover approached the podium, clearly recalibrating his planned questions in response to the unexpected strength of Jasmine's position. What followed was an intellectual sparring match of the highest order. The Andover team was indeed exceptionally skilled, challenging Jasmine's premises, questioning her evidence, and presenting compelling counter-arguments about the role of personal responsibility in contractual relationships. But Jasmine was ready. For every challenge, she had a reasoned response. For every theoretical objection, she could point to real-world examples. And underlying it all was the unmistakable authenticity of someone who wasn't just reciting researched talking points, but speaking from a place of lived understanding. When the final bell sounded ending the 90-minute round, Jasmine had no idea who had won. The Andover team had been formidable opponents, articulate and well-prepared. The judges' expressions revealed nothing as they completed their evaluation forms. As she gathered her materials, the female debater from Andover approached her. "That was incredible," she said with genuine admiration. "I've never heard someone connect theory and personal experience so effectively. You made us work harder than anyone has all year." "Thank you," Jasmine replied, surprised by the gracious comment. "You both made excellent points about the importance of clear contractual language and mutual understanding." Outside the room, Ms. Patterson was waiting with an enormous smile. "Jasmine Taylor," she said, "that was one of the finest debate performances I've ever witnessed. You didn't just present arguments, you made that room feel the real-world impact of abstract principles." Before Jasmine could respond, the door opened and the head judge emerged. "Ms. Taylor," he called, "could I speak with you for a moment?" Jasmine's heart raced as she followed him back into the now empty room. Had she violated some competition rule by referencing her personal experience? "I've been judging this competition for 12 years, the judge said, his expression serious. "And I've never done this before, but I felt compelled to tell you directly that was extraordinary. Your ability to connect complex legal and social concepts to lived experience while maintaining rigorous academic standards is something I rarely see even in law school moot court competitions." He handed her a copy of his evaluation form where she saw the highest possible scores in every category, with extensive positive comments in the margins. "Thank you, sir," Jasmine said, genuinely moved by the validation. "Keep going," he encouraged her. "Voices like yours are essential in these conversations." As Jasmine left the room to find her team, word had already begun to spread about her remarkable performance. Other competitors were looking at her with new interest. Coaches were whispering to each other, and several judges from other rooms had apparently heard about her approach and were asking to observe her next round. By lunchtime, it was clear that something unprecedented was happening. Jasmine had not only won her first round decisively, she had become the talk of the competition. When the results for the morning rounds were posted, she saw her name at the top of her category with perfect scores from all 3 judges. "This is insane," Deshawn said as the team gathered for lunch. "No one gets perfect scores at nationals. No one." "It's not just your scores," Mia added, scrolling through her phone. "People are posting about your debate on social media. It's connecting with the airplane story. You're like debate famous now." Jasmine shook her head, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the attention. "I'm just making the arguments I prepared to make. The fact that I now have a personal example to reference is just coincidence." "No," Ms. Patterson said firmly. "It's not coincidence. It's the perfect intersection of preparation and opportunity. You've always had the intellectual framework to understand these issues. Now you have the lived experience to make them undeniable to others." As the day progressed, Jasmine's momentum only increased. She advanced through her second and third preliminary debates with decisive victories, her arguments growing more refined and powerful with each round. By the end of the day, she had qualified for the championship final with the highest cumulative score in the history of the policy debate category. At the announcement ceremony that evening, the head judge of the competition made a rare personal comment. "Tomorrow's final round will feature a young woman whose presentation today reminded all of us why debate matters, because ideas have real consequences in real people's lives. I encourage everyone to attend what promises to be an extraordinary demonstration of advocacy." As Jasmine prepared for bed that night, she felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened tomorrow in the final round, she had already learned the most important lesson of her debate career: that principles weren't just theoretical concepts to be argued in classrooms, but vital protections that needed to be defended in the real world. And she was ready to do exactly that. 3 days after the incident on Flight 1108, Margaret Wilson sat stiffly in a sterile conference room at the airline's regional headquarters. Across the table were 3 people: Harris Rodriguez from Human Resources, Melissa Santos from Legal, and Thomas Reynolds, the compliance auditor who had been on the flight. "Ms. Wilson?" Harris began, his tone professional but cold. "We've completed our preliminary investigation into the events of May 15th involving passenger Jasmine Taylor on Flight 1108 to LaGuardia. Before we discuss our findings, do you have anything you'd like to add to your previous statement?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her initial written statement had claimed that she had reassigned Jasmine's seat due to a suspected mechanical issue, which she insisted had been reported to her by maintenance staff. She had denied any improper arrangement with the Morrisons, characterizing their interaction as standard customer service for frequent flyers. "I stand by my statement," she said tightly. "This is being blown out of proportion." Thomas Reynolds opened a laptop and turned the screen toward Margaret. "We have access to all system logs, Ms. Wilson. There was no maintenance report filed for Seat 2B on Flight 1108. No work order, no documentation of any kind suggesting a mechanical issue. Margaret's face remained impassive, but a slight tremor in her hands betrayed her discomfort. Additionally, Melissa Santos continued, we have testimony from multiple passengers, including a federal judge and our own flight attendant, Sofia Alvarez, that directly contradicts your account of what transpired at the gate. Most significantly, Thomas added, we have Elizabeth Morrison's statement made in front of numerous witnesses on the aircraft that you had an arrangement with them whereby you would provide preferential seating in exchange for compensation, an arrangement she claimed had occurred before on other flights. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Elizabeth Morrison is trying to save herself. She's lying. Harris Rodriguez slid a folder across the table. Actually, Ms. Wilson, we've reviewed your gate activity for the past 6 months. There's a pattern of overrides using your credentials that cannot be explained by normal operational needs. In at least 17 instances, you used administrative override codes to reassign premium seats minutes before boarding, often to the same small group of passengers. That proves nothing, Margaret insisted, though her voice had lost its certainty. Perhaps not conclusively, Melissa acknowledged. But we've also examined your personal bank records, which you authorized us to review in your employment agreement. Margaret's face paled. There are multiple cash deposits coinciding with these overrides, Melissa continued. Small amounts presumably to avoid triggering reporting requirements, but consistent and suspicious in their timing. Thomas leaned forward. Ms. Wilson, we're not just dealing with a customer service issue here. What you've done potentially constitutes fraud, commercial bribery, and violation of federal transportation regulations regarding equitable treatment of passengers. The investigation into Margaret Wilson's conduct wasn't as straightforward as it first appeared. During her disciplinary hearing, she presented a defense that highlighted structural pressures within the airline industry. I'm not denying what happened, she said, her composure cracking. But I want the committee to understand the impossible position gate agents are placed in. We're explicitly told to prioritize high-status passengers while maintaining on-time departures. Our performance metrics depend on it. She produced emails from management emphasizing VIP passenger satisfaction and creative problem-solving to accommodate elite status members. The system incentivizes exactly what I did, Margaret continued. I'm not the only one who bends the rules for frequent flyers. I'm just the one who got caught. Harris Rodriguez from HR exchanged uncomfortable glances with the other committee members. Margaret wasn't entirely wrong. There was an unwritten culture of special treatment for high-value customers. That may explain your actions, Ms. Wilson, Melissa Santos from legal finally said, but it doesn't excuse them. What makes your case particularly serious is the pattern of targeting younger passengers and passengers of color for displacement. Margaret stiffened. The data shows otherwise. Thomas Reynolds interrupted, displaying a chart of seat reassignments under Margaret's credentials. When facing overbooked flights or VIP accommodation requests, you consistently chose passengers from specific demographic groups to downgrade or reassign. The revelation silenced Margaret's defense. The pattern once documented was undeniable even to her. I didn't realize I was doing that, she said quietly. Unconscious bias is still bias, Thomas replied, especially when it affects people's contractual rights. Margaret's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. What happens now? She asked quietly. Your employment with the airline is terminated effective immediately, Harris stated flatly. You'll surrender your credentials and company property before leaving the building today. Additionally, Melissa added, we're required to report these findings to the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection for possible civil penalties. And depending on their assessment, Thomas concluded, there could be criminal implications as well, particularly if this is determined to be a pattern of discriminatory behavior targeting specific demographic groups. As Margaret Wilson was escorted from the building 30 minutes later, her 23-year career with the airline concluded in disgrace. She found herself wondering how it had all unraveled so quickly. The answer, though she couldn't fully appreciate it, was simple. She had underestimated a 17-year-old black girl from Houston who knew her rights and refused to be silenced. Meanwhile, across town in the prestigious offices of Morrison and Bailey Law, a different but equally consequential meeting was taking place. The firm's executive committee, 6 senior partners who collectively controlled the firm's management, had convened an emergency session to address the viral video showing founding partner Gregory Morrison's behavior on Flight 1108. At Morrison and Bailey Law, the partners' emergency meeting revealed divisions within the firm about how to handle Gregory's behavior. Greg's actions were inexcusable, Patricia Liang argued. But are we prepared to end a 25-year partnership over one incident? James Wilson, the firm's general counsel, shook his head. This isn't about one incident. It's about judgment and ethics. A founding partner who thinks rules don't apply to him is a liability in our profession. Another partner, Robert Fernandez, spoke up. There's also the matter of firm culture. What message does it send to our associates if we excuse this behavior from leadership? The debate continued for hours, reflecting the complicated reality of institutional change. Some partners argued for a suspension rather than forced resignation. Others worried about the financial implications of losing a major rainmaker. In the end, David Harrington made the decisive argument, beyond ethics, this is about survival. 3 major clients have already withdrawn their business. How many more will follow if we appear to condone Greg's behavior? The vote wasn't unanimous, but the majority prevailed. Gregory Morrison would have to resign. The conference room was tense, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken judgment as Gregory Morrison himself sat at one end of the table, attempting to maintain his dignity despite the circumstances. Greg, began David Harrington, the managing partner, we've reviewed the videos, the social media response, and the statements from other passengers. The situation is problematic, to put it mildly. It's being completely misrepresented. Gregory insisted, though, with less conviction than he might have mustered a few days earlier. We were the victims of a systematic attempt to humiliate us for a simple misunderstanding about seating assignments. Patricia Liang, head of the firm's ethics committee, fixed him with a steely gaze. A simple misunderstanding that began with you and Elizabeth bribing an airline employee to give you a seat that rightfully belonged to someone else. Gregory flinched. There's no evidence of any bribe. Your wife admitted it on the plane, Patricia replied sharply, in front of dozens of witnesses, including a federal judge and an airline compliance auditor. The video has over 3 million views now, Greg. Everyone has heard Elizabeth say you've done it before. She was flustered, Gregory attempted. She misspoke. David Harrington sighed heavily. Greg, we're not just concerned about the allegation of bribery, though that's serious enough. We're concerned about your recorded behavior afterward, threatening a minor, attempting to intimidate airline staff, making comments that could be construed as racially motivated. That's absurd, Gregory protested. I never said anything racial. You specifically complained about reverse discrimination when asked to vacate a seat that wasn't yours, Patricia pointed out. The context makes the implication clear. The State Bar Association has already opened an ethics investigation, added James Wilson, the firm's general counsel. They've received multiple complaints, including one from Judge Eleanor Grayson, who was apparently on the flight. Gregory paled visibly at the mention of Judge Grayson, whose reputation in legal circles was formidable. We've also lost 3 major clients since yesterday, David continued grimly. They've explicitly cited the video and their unwillingness to be associated with the behavior displayed. Gregory looked around the table, suddenly aware that this wasn't just a reprimand, it was an execution. What are you saying exactly? We're invoking Article 7 of the Partnership Agreement, David said formally. Conduct detrimental to the firm's reputation and business interests. We're asking for your immediate resignation. And if I refuse, then we'll hold a full partnership vote on your involuntary separation," Patricia stated flatly. "Based on the conversations I've had with other partners, you would lose that vote decisively." Gregory Morrison had built his career on projecting power and confidence, on never showing weakness in negotiations. But in this moment, facing the unified judgment of his peers and the irreparable damage to his professional reputation, that carefully constructed facade crumbled. "I'll have my resignation letter to you by the end of day," he said quietly. As the meeting concluded, Gregory remained seated alone in the conference room, staring out at the Manhattan skyline from the 47th floor. His mind returned to the moment on the plane when he had sneered at Jasmine Taylor, dismissing her rights because she didn't fit his image of who belonged in first class. He had never imagined that the consequences of that moment would cost him the firm he had helped build over 25 years, his professional reputation, and possibly even his license to practice law. Across town, Elizabeth Morrison was experiencing her own version of accountability. The board of the Riverside Country Club, where she had chaired numerous charity events and built her social status over decades, had called an emergency meeting of the membership committee. "Elizabeth," said Victoria Fairchild, the board president and Elizabeth's former friend of 15 years, "the video from that flight has been seen by everyone in our community. The comments you made, both to the young lady whose seat you took and to other passengers, reflect values that are incompatible with our club's commitment to inclusivity and ethical conduct." "Vicky, please," Elizabeth pleaded. "You know me. This is being blown completely out of proportion." "Is it?" asked Dr. James Henderson, another board member who oversaw the club's scholarship program for underprivileged youth. "Because what we saw was you knowingly accepting a seat that was taken from a young person who had worked months to afford it, then defending that action with statements that many have interpreted as discriminatory." "That's not fair," Elizabeth protested. "I never said anything about her race." "You didn't have to," Victoria replied coldly. "Your behavior spoke volumes." "The board has voted unanimously," Dr. Henderson continued. "Your membership is being revoked under Article 12 of the club bylaws. Conduct detrimental to the character and reputation of the club." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Membership at Riverside was the cornerstone of her social identity, the source of her most important connections and relationships. "Effective immediately," Victoria added, "you are no longer welcome on club premises. Any events you were scheduled to chair will be reassigned. Your personal belongings from your locker will be packed and delivered to your home." As Elizabeth left the club for the final time, she noticed how people who had greeted her warmly for years now averted their eyes or turned away entirely. The social capital she had spent decades accumulating had evaporated overnight. The consequences continued to unfold in the days that followed. The airline issued a formal apology to Jasmine Taylor, along with a complete refund of her ticket price vouchers for future travel and a lifetime upgrade to their highest loyalty status tier. More significantly, they announced a comprehensive review of their seat assignment protocols and staff training, with a specific focus on equitable treatment of all passengers. The Department of Transportation opened an investigation into the incident, focusing on potential violations of federal regulations regarding discriminatory practices in air travel. Several civil rights organizations reached out to Jasmine, offering legal support if she chose to pursue a formal discrimination complaint. Margaret Wilson not only lost her job, but found herself essentially unemployable in the airline industry, her reputation permanently tarnished by the viral video and subsequent investigation findings. The Morrisons faced both professional and social ostracism. Gregory's resignation from his law firm was followed by an ethics investigation by the State Bar Association, which would ultimately result in a 6-month suspension of his license to practice. Elizabeth's expulsion from the country club was just the beginning of a social exile that would see the couple excluded from the circles they had once dominated. But perhaps the most significant consequence was one that couldn't be measured in professional sanctions or social rejections. The incident had sparked a nationwide conversation about privilege accountability and the everyday indignities faced by those deemed not to belong in certain spaces. For Jasmine Taylor, watching these consequences unfold from a distance, the experience was bittersweet. She hadn't sought retribution or punishment for those involved. She had simply wanted what she had paid for: the dignity of having her contract honored, her rights respected, and her humanity acknowledged. Yet there was undeniable justice in seeing systems of accountability actually function as intended in witnessing powerful people face consequences for behavior that might once have been dismissed or excused. As she prepared to board her return flight to Houston, in first class as promised by the airline, Jasmine reflected on how a seemingly small moment of injustice had cascaded into a much larger reckoning. Perhaps that was how change happened sometimes, not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through individual acts of principled resistance that revealed the fault lines in systems built on inequity. The seat that had been denied to her 3 days earlier was now indisputably hers. But more importantly, she carried with her the knowledge that her voice mattered, that justice was possible, and that sometimes standing up for what was right could create ripples far beyond what anyone might have imagined. 1 year after the incident that became known across social media as #JusticeInTheAir, Jasmine Taylor stood at a podium in the East Ridge High School auditorium, addressing the assembled senior class and their families at graduation. As valedictorian, she had earned the right to deliver the farewell address, but her journey to this moment had been anything but traditional. "When I boarded that flight to New York last May," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I was just a girl with a debate topic about barriers and contracts. I had no idea I was about to experience a real-world case study that would change the trajectory of my life." The audience listened intently. Many knew her story. It had been featured in national news, discussed on talk shows, and even referenced in a congressional hearing on transportation equity. What had begun as a personal indignity had become a touchpoint in a larger conversation about dignity, respect, and the everyday enforcement of rights. "What I learned from that experience wasn't just about airline policies or consumer rights," Jasmine continued. "It was about the power of standing up for yourself with dignity, about the importance of allies who are willing to speak up when they witness injustice, and about how systems can change when enough people demand accountability." In the years since the incident, Jasmine's life had transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. After winning the National Youth Forensics Championship with a perfect score, an unprecedented achievement, she had received scholarship offers from 17 universities, including every Ivy League school. The implementation of the Taylor Protocol across the airline industry wasn't without resistance. Initially, only Jasmine's airline adopted the new guidelines for transparent seat assignment practices. Other carriers dismissed it as an overreaction to a singular incident. That changed when consumer advocacy groups began conducting audit testing, sending passengers of different backgrounds with identical reservations to document treatment disparities. The resulting data showed troubling patterns that couldn't be explained away as isolated incidents. Within 6 months, 2 more major airlines had adopted similar protocols. Within a year, it had become an industry standard championed by the Department of Transportation as a model practice. Perhaps most meaningfully, Jasmine had established the Fly High Foundation with some of the settlement funds she had received, providing travel scholarships to low-income students competing in academic competitions across the country. "As we leave East Ridge High today," she concluded, "we carry with us the knowledge that our voices matter, that justice is possible, and that sometimes standing up for what's right creates change far beyond what we might imagine. The world isn't always fair, but that doesn't mean we should accept unfairness as inevitable. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, 'This isn't right,' and having the courage to stand firm in that truth." As Jasmine returned to her seat amid thunderous applause, she caught her grandmother's eye in the audience. Grandma Johnson was beaming with pride, tears streaming down her face. It was her words that had started Jasmine on this journey. You go fly, baby, and you fly up front. Show them how it's done. Jasmine had done exactly that in more ways than one, and in the fall she would be attending Harvard Law School on a full scholarship with an acceptance letter that specifically mentioned her extraordinary demonstration of advocacy skills and commitment to justice. Qualities she had exhibited not just in debate competitions, but in that pivotal moment when she refused to accept being treated as less than she deserved. What had begun as a seat assignment dispute had become something much more significant, a reminder that dignity wasn't a luxury or a privilege but a right that belonged to everyone regardless of who they were or where they came from. And sometimes defending that dignity could change not just one moment or one flight, but create ripples of transformation that continued long after the journey's end. If you were inspired by this true story of courage and standing up for what's right, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful content that shines a light on everyday heroes. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters and that one person can truly make a difference. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Remember, sometimes the most powerful form of change starts with simply refusing to accept injustice.